In the vast silence of prehistory, before humans ever drew maps or carved words into stone, the oceans carried secrets too immense to fit into memory. Beneath waves that rolled endlessly over primeval coasts, there existed a predator so colossal that its presence bent entire ecosystems around its hunger. Megalodon, a shark of unimaginable scale, ruled these waters for millions of years, a creature whose very shadow could send ripples of fear through the seas. Its teeth, larger than a human hand and serrated like ancient knives, are the fragments left behind, scattered in cliffs and riverbeds, silent testimonies of a beast long gone. But these relics do more than whisper its size. They hint at the story of power, climate, and survival, at the delicate balance between predator and prey that once defined life beneath the surface. Each fossil becomes a question. How did such dominance arise, and why did it eventually vanish? The world Megalodon inherited was not ours. Continents drifted closer, sea levels swelled, and entire chains of life wove themselves into the tapestry of oceanic kingdoms. To step into this time is to descend into a theatre of both beauty and brutality, where giant whales, armoured fish, and the ever-shifting earth itself played roles in an unfolding drama of existence. This is the story of how Megalodon ruled the ancient seas, and how the ocean it shaped continues to echo its reign. Welcome to Arcane Skies. If you find yourself drawn into this voyage, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment to share where and when you are watching. The story begins in a time when the Earth itself was still learning to breathe in rhythms we might recognise today. The Miocene epoch, stretching back nearly 20 million years, was an age of warm seas and restless continents. Vast currents swept across the planet, shaping coastlines, redistributing heat, and dictating the rise and fall of life in the oceans. It was within this shifting stage that Megalodon emerged, not as an accident, but as the apex answer to the demands of survival in waters teeming with abundance and competition. To imagine these seas, one must erase the familiar outlines of our present world. South America was still stitching its connection to North America. The Isthmus of Panama had not yet sealed the great passage between oceans. This allowed the Atlantic and Pacific to exchange waters, fueling powerful migrations of species that tested predators and prey alike. The climate, warmer than today, filled the seas with a richness of plankton, which in turn fed small fish, then larger fish, then the leviathans that roamed in herds through the waves. Baleen whales, some reaching lengths we would still consider extraordinary, swam in great numbers across the basins, their bodies like moving islands of meat and fat. They were the fortune of predators and the fuel for giants. Megalodon's rise was written into this ecological script. From its smaller shark ancestors, it carried the genetic inheritance of speed, strength, and teeth, designed not merely to puncture but to sever. Imagine jaws so wide a person could stand upright within them, teeth serrated like stone tools sharpened by tides. Each bite was not a tentative strike, but a decision of finality, cutting through thick flesh and bone. The very structure of Megalodon's jaw suggests a hunting style adapted for power rather than subtlety. A predator that attacked with overwhelming force, ensuring prey could not recover from the first assault. The whales of the Miocene had no defence against such a predator except for their own numbers and their vast migrations. Schools of dolphins scattered like silver shards when a shadow passed overhead, and young whales lingered dangerously near coastal shallows where Megalodon could easily corner them. The predator's world was not one of endless violence but of constant calculation, waiting for the vulnerable, striking at the moment when the ocean's orchestra shifted into panic. This balance between predator and prey is what defines an ecosystem, and in the ancient seas it was sharpened to a knife's edge. Megalodon, though immense, was not alone. Other great sharks prowled, such as the ancestors of modern great whites. Sperm whales, with teeth that rivaled spears, engaged in battles for dominance and food. Some even suggest that the ancestors of orcas may have tested their strength against smaller megalodons, introducing whispers of a struggle that would one day decide the fate of giants. But during the height of its reign, Megalodon was unmatched in scale, a ruler in a kingdom with no true challenger. To understand why such dominance mattered, one must consider the ocean as more than a hunting ground. Each act of predation rippled through the food web, shaping which species thrived and which dwindled. By preying on whales, Megalodon influenced the very structure of marine populations. It prevented overabundance of large filter feeders, kept balance among smaller species, and ensured that nutrients from whale carcasses enriched deep ocean floors. Even in death, its meals seeded life for countless other creatures. In this sense, Megalodon was not simply a terror of flesh and blood, but a force of equilibrium, sculpting the invisible mathematics of the sea. And yet, the ocean was not a static stage. Geological processes far above the waterline were writing new chapters. The slow rise of mountain ranges altered winds, shifted currents, and gradually cooled the planet. Antarctica, once cloaked in forests, was already locked in ice. The expansion of polar sheets began to steal warmth from the oceans, a change subtle in human measure but monumental across millennia. These shifts whispered of a future where the seas would no longer be the same, where the very food chains that sustained giants would be tested by scarcity. Still, for millions of years, Megalodon thrived. It moved across oceans in search of calving grounds, following whale migrations like a shadow tethered to their lives. Fossils of its teeth appear on every continent except Antarctica, evidence of a global dominion that few species have ever achieved. These teeth, often found miles from present coastlines, reveal not just its presence, but the shifting nature of the Earth itself. Ancient seabeds now lifted into cliffs remind us that the world Megalodon ruled is buried beneath our feet, waiting for waves of human hands to uncover. The thought of such a predator roaming through waters we now consider safe humbles the imagination. Standing on a modern beach, with waves foaming gently at the shore, one can forget that the sea has not always been so forgiving. A swimmer in those ancient shallows would be less than a flicker in the eye of a megalodon, an irrelevance in a theatre scaled for giants. Yet the fear it inspires is not only in size, but in what it represents. The raw will of evolution to push life toward extremes, to test the boundaries of survival and dominance. But questions linger like shadows beneath the surface. How did this predator sustain itself across so many millennia without exhausting its prey? What forces allowed such balance to hold when in nature the pendulum often swings toward collapse? Perhaps the answer lies not just in Megalodon's ferocity, but in the richness of its time. Oceans swollen with life, where the cycles of birth and death were vast enough to support giants. And as the Miocene seas glittered under ancient suns, Megalodon continued to reign, its presence a constant reminder that even in abundance, power demands vigilance. The world it inherited was warm and generous, but generosity is never eternal. Currents were shifting, temperatures cooling, and prey itself evolving in ways that would test the limits of even the greatest hunter. In the distance, unseen and unrecognized, the first hints of change stirred. Change that would one day rewrite the laws of the ocean, and with them, the fate of the Megalodon. Far below the waves, where light fades into the blue unknown, silence gathers around questions that cannot yet be answered. What new forces would rise from the deep, and what challenges would carve themselves into the path of this apex predator? The answers, like shadows carried on currents, awaited in the oceans of the future. As the Miocene rolled forward into its Middle Ages, the seas grew ever more complex, a theatre not of one predator, but of entire symphonies of survival. The reign of Megalodon was never a solitary story. It was interwoven with countless actors, each shaped by the currents of evolution, each adapting to a stage where abundance bred both opportunity and peril. The oceans of this epoch were alive with movement, migrations of whales that stretched across hemispheres, swarms of fish that shimmered like liquid silver beneath the sunlit surface, and armoured sea turtles whose shells bore the weight of millennia of design. To imagine Megalodon without them is to miss the pulse of its world, for a predator is only as mighty as the system that sustains it. The whales were the centerpieces of this world. Mysticetes, the baleen whales, had begun their astonishing diversification, spreading into oceans like vast living machines of filter feeding. Some were small, barely larger than a bus, while others dwarfed modern creatures in girth and presence. They swept krill and plankton from the waters with each pass, converting invisible clouds of life into mountains of flesh. These herds were not mere prey, they were ecosystems unto themselves, carrying barnacles, fish, and birds along their routes. For Megalodon, they were a feast both bountiful and necessary. A single strike against a whale calf could sustain the shark for weeks, even months. Yet to take down such prey required timing, force, and patience honed over millions of years. Predation among giants has always been an arms race. Whales did not surrender their lives easily. Fossil evidence suggests that some developed migratory patterns to carve in shallower, warmer seas, waters where the bulk of Megalodon's massive body would be a disadvantage, where maneuverability mattered more than raw power. In this subtle contest, evolution played its endless hand. Megalodon grew larger, stronger, and more efficient, while whales adjusted their habits, shifting their migrations like dancers, avoiding the sweep of a predator's shadow. What resulted was not extinction on either side, but balance, a fragile shifting equilibrium that allowed both hunter and hunted to endure. But the whales were not the only giants of the Miocene seas. The sperm whales of the time were formidable in their own right, toothed predators capable of clashing with a large fish, squid, and even other whales. Some species bore teeth nearly as fearsome as megalodons, their skulls built for battle. Picture the clash, a megalodon rising from the depths, its maw gaping like the entrance to another world, only to meet the charge of a massive sperm whale, head reinforced like a battering ram. These encounters were not daily events. Nature rarely wastes energy on unnecessary conflict, but they were possible, and in such possibilities lies the grandeur of prehistory. The sea was never owned, only shared, and each confrontation reshaped the unwritten boundaries of dominion. Beneath these titanic struggles, smaller dramas unfolded. Schools of mackerel and tuna darted in dazzling formations, their lives bound to the movements of currents and temperature. Ancient dolphins, more varied than those of today, chattered and hunted in pods, demonstrating intelligence that may have allowed them to evade even the swiftest predator. Sea turtles, armoured in thick shells, navigated migrations that crossed entire oceans, their bodies carrying algae and hitchhiking crustaceans like living islands. Sharks, smaller than Megalodon, filled every niche, from scavengers slicing chunks from carcasses left behind, to agile hunters of squid that pulsed through the twilight zone of the seas. Everywhere one looks in this ancient ocean, one sees the outlines of a modern life blurred with forms now vanished. Dugongs grazed on seagrass beds that stretched like underwater meadows, stirring sediments as they fed. Giant penguins, remnants of earlier ages, still lingered in southern waters, their bodies sleek and powerful enough to compete with fish for survival. Crocodiles, adapted for saltwater, prowled estuaries and coastlines, their ambushes silent and sudden. The ocean was not a uniform kingdom under Megalodon's rule, but a mosaic of dominions where countless species fought to exist. Megalodon's reign was supreme, but it was not absolute. And yet, even in this abundance, the seeds of change were already sprouting. The Earth's tectonic plates shifted ceaselessly, sculpting continents into new shapes. The collision of South America with North America crept closer, a union that would eventually close the seaway and redirect ocean currents forever. The Mediterranean basin dried and refilled in cycles, trapping and releasing life in an immense geological rhythm. Each shift of land altered the flows of water, and with it the delicate networks of life. Climate, too, was beginning to cool ever so slightly. The polar caps expanded, tightening their icy grip. Currents began to sharpen, reorganizing the delivery of nutrients across the seas. For Megalodon, these changes were imperceptible in the span of a single lifetime. Generations rose and fell while the ocean still seemed plentiful. Yet across the canvas of millions of years, the transformations were profound. Prey patterns shifted, migrations lengthened or shortened, and the margins of survival narrowed. In ecosystems, abundance is never guaranteed. It is a brief moment balanced on a knife's edge. For every species that thrives, another must adapt or perish. Megalodon's power was immense, but it was tethered to the continuity of prey, to the rhythms of oceans that were themselves slowly unravelling. What makes this picture haunting is the contrast between dominance and fragility. In the prime of its reign, Megalodon was a force beyond imagination, a predator that shaped the seas in ways both direct and invisible. Its existence was a statement of nature's ability to create extremes, and yet the very conditions that allowed such extremes were vulnerable to time's patience. Oceans swell, climates shift, and ecosystems bend under the weight of change. The story of Megalodon is not only about supremacy, but about the precarious stage upon which all supremacy rests. Picture for a moment the endless horizon of a Miocene ocean, the sky washed gold by a sinking sun. Beneath the surface, baleen whales drift in slow arcs, their flukes rising and falling like the hands of a clock. In the distance, a shadow coils upward from the deep, vast and deliberate, cutting through shafts of fading light. Around it, fish scatter, dolphins split in coordinated bursts, and the sea itself seems to hold its breath. This was the daily theatre of existence, and each performance was a reminder that survival was never guaranteed, even for the strongest. The questions that follow emerged like ripples from a stone cast into still water. How long could such balance last before shifting currents and cooling seas began to tilt the scales? How many millennia could even the greatest hunter endure before the world that sustained it began to fade? The Miocene seas carried answers not yet visible, but they were there, gathering in silence. And as night fell over the ancient oceans, stars mirrored in the black waters. The predators and prey beneath carried on their endless dance. Life moved forward, blind to the larger forces building far beyond the horizon. Those forces would not arrive tomorrow, nor even in the next 1,000 years, but they were already in motion, and when they arrived, they would test the endurance of Megalodon itself, reshaping not just its fate, but the fate of the entire ocean. To enter the late Miocene seas is to step into a realm where power and fragility brushed against one another like shifting tides. Megalodon thrived in this age, its dominance unquestioned, yet its existence was tied to forces larger than its own vast body. The world that surrounded it was undergoing changes so gradual that no single creature could sense them, but together they formed a slow current of transformation, shaping destinies with invisible hands. The very waters in which Megalodon hunted were sculpted by geological upheaval. The continents of the earth never stood still, they drifted, collided, and reshaped the flow of oceans. As South America inched ever closer to meeting North America, the seaway that once joined the Atlantic and Pacific began to narrow. Though the Isthmus of Panama had not yet sealed shut, its gradual rise was altering currents that had for millions of years allowed the free passage of species and nutrients. This narrowing corridor acted like a valve, changing the circulation of warm and cold waters. Nutrient-rich upwelling shifted, food webs bent to the will of geography, and predators found their ancient hunting grounds slowly evolving into unfamiliar seas. Megalodon's vast range, proven by the fossil record, suggests a predator capable of adapting to nearly every oceanic stage. Its teeth have been unearthed from Europe's coasts, North and South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia, a near global map of its dominion. But distribution does not equal comfort. Each region presented its own challenges. Colder waters demanded greater energy to sustain heat. Coastal areas forced navigation of shallows too narrow for a giant's turn, and shifting prey populations meant that strategy had to be endlessly recalibrated. What preserved Megalodon's supremacy was not only size but flexibility. A predator that could traverse entire oceans to chase migrations, following prey into new and dangerous waters. Consider the hunt itself. Fossilized whale bones bearing deep gouges tell a story not of chance encounters but of calculated strikes. Megalodon likely employed ambush techniques, rising from the depths where sunlight fades into shadows, launching upward with jaws that could exert pressures beyond comprehension. A single bite to a whale's fins could immobilize, stripping away its speed and leaving it vulnerable. In this way, Megalodon was not only a brute force predator, but also a tactician, targeting weak points with devastating efficiency. Survival on such a scale demanded more than strength. It required knowledge written in instinct, a memory of strategies carried through countless generations. Yet, for all its dominance, the ocean around Megalodon was thick with rivals and collaborators alike. Smaller sharks thrived in its wake, scavenging from the remains of its kills. Sperm whales patrolled deeper waters, their battles with colossal squid leaving scars that spoke of nocturnal wars in the abyss. Dolphins, already social and cunning, used speed and group tactics to evade, weaving through currents with intelligence that made them elusive targets. Even seabirds played their part, circling above the chaos of a kill, plunging for scraps that rose to the surface. The sea was a stage of endless competition and dependence, each role linked to the others in a web so intricate that no predator, not even Megalodon, could stand apart from it. Amid this complexity, the climate began whispering its first warnings. The Earth's tilt, orbit, and the pull of the moon created cycles known as Milankovitch cycles, long-term shifts in climate that dictated ice ages and warm periods. As the Miocene waned, subtle cooling trends began to spread, encouraging the growth of ice sheets and lowering global sea levels. These changes influenced not just the temperature of waters, but the productivity of entire ecosystems. Cold waters, rich in nutrients, favoured some species of whales while disadvantaging others. Migration shifted in rhythm, forcing Megalodon to adapt again and again, extending its range, altering its timing, pursuing prey into unfamiliar environments. Still, the balance held. For millions of years, predator and prey adapted to each other's moves, the ocean alive with the tension of survival. The story of Megalodon during this time was not one of decline, but of flourishing. Its teeth, shed by the thousands over a lifetime, rained down into sediments across the world, each one a silent marker of its continued reign. To the creatures that lived in its shadow, the shark was not an anomaly, but a constant, an ancient truth of the seas. Whales grew cautious, dolphins grew quick, and even the seabeds grew richer as Megalodon's kills sank to the depths, feeding scavengers and ecosystems that thrived in darkness. Yet questions rise like bubbles from the deep. Could any creature so immense truly endure the relentless changes of Earth's climate and currents? Or was Megalodon's very size its greatest strength, also its eventual weakness? In biology, gigantism is both marvel and gamble. To grow so large is to require abundant food, vast hunting grounds, and stable environments. When the balance shifts, giants are the first to feel the weight of scarcity. In this way, Megalodon's supremacy was already a precarious crown, glittering but fragile, its brilliance dependent on the generosity of a world that could change without warning. The whales, too, began their own transformations. Some evolved to dive deeper, beyond the easy reach of surface hunters. Others refined migratory paths into colder, nutrient-rich waters, where Megalodon's bulk would be tested against frigid temperatures. These evolutionary gambits were not conscious acts, but the slow shaping of generations, each adaptation a small answer to the question of survival. Against this backdrop, Megalodon continued its relentless pursuit, adjusting, persisting, and carving its presence into every ocean it could reach. Picture, if you will, a Miocene shoreline. Cliffs not yet weathered into the forms we know, forests pressing close to the waves, their roots reaching for salt spray. Offshore, whales move in procession, their bodies glinting like bronze under the sun. Suddenly the water darkens. A shadow rises, vast and deliberate, and in that moment the ancient balance reveals itself once again. A predator's strike, a prey's desperate attempt to flee, and the sea's eternal silence closing in after the violence has passed. These are the scenes that repeated for millions of years, shaping the very bones of species and the fossils we now unearth. The ocean of the late Miocene was not yet finished with its transformations. Beneath the calm surface of its abundance, changes gathered momentum. Currents whispered of new patterns, and climates hinted at sharper extremes to come. Megalodon remained supreme, but the stage was shifting under its fins. What forces were building, unseen, that could one day erode even the strongest predator? The answer drifted not in the shallow seas, but in the vast, deep rhythms of Earth itself. Rhythms that would soon swell into challenges beyond even the reach of giants. The ocean of the late Miocene was a place of fluid boundaries, where continents pressed closer, and climates rehearsed the cooling rhythms that would one day define the Pliocene. Megalodon swam through these waters as an unchallenged apex predator, but beneath its immense shadow, the entire marine world pulsed with interlocking stories of survival. To understand how Megalodon ruled is to descend deeper, not only into its hunting grounds, but into the hidden fabric of the seas that sustained both prey and predator alike. Life in the Miocene oceans thrived on the invisible generosity of plankton. These drifting organisms, too small for the eye yet vast enough to alter climate, were the foundation of the marine food web. Blooms of phytoplankton, powered by sunlight and nutrients stirred up by currents, fed zooplankton, which in turn nourished schools of fish. The cascade from microscopic to massive was relentless. Fish sustained dolphins, dolphins evaded sharks, whales filtered entire clouds of plankton, and Megalodon hovered at the pinnacle, tracing every thread down to the smallest origin. A predator of such size was more than a hunter. It was a reflection of the ocean's fertility, its existence possible only because the seas beneath it swarmed with life at every scale. The structure of these ecosystems was not uniform across the globe. Coastal shelves, shallow and sunlit, were nurseries of abundance. Here, seagrass beds stretched like submerged prairies, where dugongs and manatees grazed while turtles drifted slowly, armoured against the occasional attack. Estuaries, where rivers met the sea, carried floods of nutrients, creating zones of productivity that drew fish in countless numbers. Coral reefs, though different in scale and distribution from those we know today, flourished in warmer waters, offering shelter to smaller species and staging grounds for predators. Offshore, open ocean currents carried life into vast moving highways, where whales travelled in synchrony, tracing paths honed by generations of migration. Each of these regions was both home and battlefield, every life form tested by the presence of others. Megalodon's role in this network was more complex than simple predation. By preying on whales, especially the young and the weak, it prevented populations from outgrowing their resources. The carcasses left behind sank to the ocean floor, where deep-sea scavengers, hagfish, amphipods, and microbes invisible to the naked eye, turned them into sources of energy that lasted for decades. These whale falls became oases in the abyss, sustaining life far removed from the surface sun. In this way, every kill by Megalodon sent echoes into the deepest corners of the sea, proving that even violence carried with it the seeds of renewal. But balance is never permanent. Prey evolved as relentlessly as predators hunted. Fossil evidence suggests that some whales grew larger during this period, perhaps as a defense against predators. Size could offer safety. A fully grown adult whale was a formidable opponent, its bulk and speed too risky even for Megalodon. In response, the giant shark honed its focus on calves and juveniles, striking during migrations when families were vulnerable. This selective pressure carved itself into evolutionary history. Whales learned to adapt their migratory routes, timing births in shallower waters or colder seas, where the sheer mass of Megalodon became a liability. The ocean was not ruled by violence alone, but by an endless conversation between predator and prey, written in behaviour, movement, and adaptation. Other predators shaped this world as well. The giant sperm whales of the Miocene, some armed with teeth in both jaws, likely competed for many of the same resources. These creatures were not merely prey, but active participants in the hierarchy, predators of fish and squid whose hunting strategies could bring them into conflict with sharks. Smaller sharks swarmed in numbers, their speed making them successful in niches Megalodon's size could not fill. Even marine crocodiles patrolled coastlines, ambushing whatever crossed into their reach. Megalodon's supremacy was not absolute. It existed within a crowded stage, each creature carving its role, each adding tension to the ocean's balance. The climate itself began to intrude more directly upon these relationships. As the Miocene progressed, ice continued to gather at the poles, reshaping global currents. These currents determined where nutrients rose from the depths, dictating the richness of fisheries and the size of whale populations. Periods of abundance alternated with scarcity, like tides written on the scale of millennia. Megalodon, reliant on vast quantities of prey, felt these fluctuations more acutely than most. A predator so large could not afford lean years. Its survival depended on oceans remaining rich, on prey populations resilient enough to endure the changes. For the moment the seas still provided, but the future held uncertainties too subtle for a predator's instinct to perceive. Imagine a hunt beneath the surface. A pod of baleen whales moves slowly along a coastal shelf, calves swimming tightly between adults, their calls echoing like low thunder. Far below, the shadow of Megalodon stirs. It rises with deliberate grace, its body longer than a school bus, its mouth opening into a dark cathedral of teeth. The attack is sudden. Water erupts, whales scatter, and a single calf is seized in a grip designed by millions of years of evolution. Within minutes, the ocean returns to silence, but the echo of the strike lingers in every direction. Seabirds dive for scraps, smaller sharks circle for fragments, and in the depths, the promise of a whale fall begins. This was the rhythm of life, one death feeding 1,000 lives, one predator shaping the course of an entire ecosystem. Yet for all its might, Megalodon was bound to a paradox. Its size granted it mastery but also chained it to the mercy of abundance. Where prey faltered, Megalodon faltered. Where oceans thinned in productivity, Megalodon's reign trembled. It was not weakness, but inevitability, the price of evolution's gamble on gigantism. Nature had created a ruler unlike any before, but it had also created a system that could not remain unchanged forever. Standing on the edge of this ancient world, one can almost feel the tension. The seas are rich, life abundant, predators and prey locked in their endless dance. But behind the beauty lies fragility, a shift in currents, a drop in temperature, a change in the timing of migrations. Any of these could send ripples through the balance. For now, Megalodon remains unchallenged, a force of nature gliding silently beneath the waves. But the horizon is never still. Beneath the calm surface, deeper changes are gathering, and with them new questions arise. What happens when the seas no longer sustain such giants? How does power endure when the very foundation of abundance begins to shift? The answers would come, not in a sudden collapse, but in the slow erosion of certainty, carried forward by currents that even Megalodon could not command. And in those currents, the future of the oceans was already being written. The transition from the Miocene into the Pliocene was subtle in its unfolding, yet profound in its impact. The Earth was cooling, its heartbeat marked by the steady spread of ice sheets at the poles, and the oceans began to carry whispers of scarcity into realms that had once seemed inexhaustible. For Megalodon, this was both a continuation of abundance and the beginning of trials that would test the resilience of even the most dominant predator to have ever ruled the seas. At first glance, the Pliocene seas appeared generous. Whales remained abundant, their migrations stretching across hemispheres in rivers of flesh and song. Dolphins darted in schools, penguins thrived in the southern oceans, and the shallows brimmed with life. Yet beneath this surface richness, patterns were shifting. The eventual closure of the Central American Seaway, when North and South America fused through the rise of the Isthmus of Panama, forever reshaped global currents. What had once been a channel for warm waters to flow freely between the Atlantic and Pacific became a barrier, locking the oceans into separate rhythms. The Atlantic grew saltier and warmer, while the Pacific cooled. Such changes were invisible in the scale of a single life, but across generations they rearranged the very fabric of ecosystems. Nutrient flows, essential to plankton blooms and the vast food chains they sustained, began to reorganize. Upwellings in some regions grew richer, while others became barren stretches of water, wide and blue but poor in sustenance. This imbalance meant that while certain whale species flourished, others dwindled, reshaping the buffet upon which Megalodon depended. The predator could still roam oceans in search of prey, but its calculations grew harder. Long migrations were no longer predictable highways of sustenance. They were uncertain gambles across seas in flux. The fossil record provides haunting glimpses into this time. Megalodon teeth, once scattered across sediments with abundant regularity, begin to appear less frequently in layers dating to the later Pliocene. These teeth, monumental in size and serrated like ancient blades, tell us that the predator still reigned, but their relative rarity suggests a world where dominance no longer equaled abundance. The story was not one of immediate collapse, but of a slow thinning, a gradual tightening of the margins upon which giants depended. The whales, meanwhile, were evolving. Many species began to grow larger, a phenomenon scientists believe offered protection against predation. The blue whale, the largest animal ever to live on Earth, traces its lineage to this period, rising in size during the very time Megalodon hunted the seas. A fully grown adult whale was a formidable target, too dangerous and energy costly even for the giant shark. By growing into titans themselves, whales turned their bodies into fortresses against attack. In response, Megalodon's strategy shifted further toward calves and juveniles, but such reliance narrowed its options, making it increasingly dependent on precise timing and successful ambushes during calving migrations. This co-evolutionary dance between predator and prey was a drama written in the language of survival. Each adaptation by whales forced new strategies from Megalodon, and each counter by Megalodon pressed whales into evolving further. Yet in this back and forth, whales carried one advantage: they fed lower on the food chain. By filtering plankton and krill, they tapped directly into the ocean's base of productivity, bypassing the precarious reliance on large prey. Megalodon, however, perched at the very top, was chained to the fragile abundance below. If the base faltered, the predator faltered. The strength of its size became the weight of its dependence. But the story of this era is not simply one of whales and sharks. Other forces were at play, shaping the Pliocene seas into landscapes of both beauty and danger. In the depths, the ancestors of modern orcas began to emerge. Smaller than Megalodon but intelligent, social and cooperative, these early killer whales represented a new kind of predator, one that hunted not with sheer size but with strategy. Fossil evidence and modern analogues suggest that pod behaviour, the ability to communicate and coordinate hunts, was already developing. For Megalodon, solitary and immense, such tactics posed a subtle but growing threat. No single orca could match its power, but together they could harass, distract, and perhaps even drive a wounded giant from its kill. In a world of shifting abundance, such competition was more than an inconvenience. It was another erosion of dominance. Climate added yet another pressure. The cooling trend of the Pliocene intensified, and ice expanded at both poles. Sea levels fell in stages, reducing the extent of shallow coastal waters that had once been rich nurseries for prey. This contraction of habitats squeezed life into narrower margins. Species that relied on warm, shallow seas struggled, while cold-adapted species spread into new ranges. Megalodon could follow its prey into colder waters, but its sheer size may have made such pursuits costly, demanding energy it could no longer afford to waste. And yet, even in the face of such mounting challenges, Megalodon remained a force unlike any other. For millions of years it continued to roam oceans across the world, its presence shaping the behaviour of every species it encountered. Whales altered their migrations, dolphins adjusted their group patterns, and smaller predators carved their lives in the spaces left behind. To live in the Pliocene seas was to live in the shadow of a hunter whose very existence reshaped evolution itself. Still, fragility hummed beneath the surface. The delicate threads of climate, currents and prey populations were weaving into patterns that no giant could control. What made Megalodon magnificent was also what made it vulnerable. Its reliance on vast oceans brimming with life. Each change, a new current, a shift in whale size, the rise of cooperative predators, pressed against the edges of its survival. Picture a scene in the Pliocene. A pod of whales glides through cooler waters, their breath steaming in the morning air as they surface. Below, a Megalodon tracks their movements, patient and deliberate, its vast body moving with the slow certainty of a creature that has always ruled. But as it closes the distance, the whales scatter with unexpected coordination, their calves shielded in formations that frustrate the predator. The giant circles, waits, test their defences, but no opportunity arises. Hours pass, then days, and the energy cost grows. In the end, the shark drifts away, a ruler whose dominion is no longer absolute. The image lingers, not of defeat, but of fragility. Even the most powerful predator is bound to the rules of an ecosystem it cannot command. Megalodon was not undone in a single strike or by a singular rival. It was tested by the slow, relentless weight of change. And though it still reigned in the Pliocene seas, the question deepened with every passing millennium. How long could such dominance last before the balance tipped irrevocably? The answer, as with so many of Earth's great mysteries, was already being written in the currents. The oceans carried within them not only the memory of giants, but the seeds of their eventual disappearance, waiting for the moment when even the strongest shadow could no longer hold against the tide. The Pliocene seas carried both abundance and unease, a paradox that defined the age for Megalodon. On one hand, the ocean still pulsed with life. Whales, dolphins, and shoals of fish migrated in endless rhythms, ensuring that food remained within reach. On the other hand, each migration seemed subtly altered, each current slightly reconfigured, each coastline slowly reshaped by the forces of geology and climate. Megalodon was still master of the seas, but mastery no longer meant certainty. The predator's reign, though continuing, was increasingly tied to variables beyond its control. The Isthmus of Panama, that rising strip of land connecting North and South America, was nearing its final closure. In geological terms, the process was slow, yet the effects were monumental. When the waters between the Atlantic and Pacific were severed, ocean circulation patterns reorganized across the globe. The Atlantic grew warmer and saltier, fueling the beginnings of powerful current systems such as the Gulf Stream. These currents redistributed heat, bringing warm waters further north, but they also altered the productivity of seas. Some regions that had once been fertile grew barren, while new upwellings concentrated life in different corridors. For whales, this meant migrations lengthened or shifted into unfamiliar ranges. For Megalodon, which had evolved to track those migrations, the change was a subtle trap. The old patterns no longer applied, and the energy cost of following prey increased. This was not a sudden crisis, but a slow tightening. Fossil sites along ancient coastlines reveal the footprints of these shifts. The abundance of Megalodon teeth in Miocene layers gives way to thinner deposits in Pliocene sediments, not vanishing outright, but appearing less frequently. These fossil clues, silent in their testimony, point toward a predator that was not gone but already being tested. Each tooth unearthed today is more than a relic. It is a whisper of a life lived in an ocean where certainty was dissolving. Meanwhile, whales themselves were transforming. Larger and more resilient species began to dominate, particularly baleen whales that fed on krill and plankton. This evolutionary expansion towards size was both a blessing and a curse for Megalodon. On one hand, the sheer volume of meat a large whale provided could sustain a giant predator for months. On the other hand, an adult whale of colossal proportions was a dangerous opponent, capable of injuring or even killing an attacker with a single strike of its fluke. As prey grew larger and more robust, Megalodon's hunting strategies narrowed further toward juveniles, whose vulnerability was increasingly protected by social behaviours. Calvers were shielded in the centre of pods, adults coordinated their defences, and migrations into colder, shallower waters offered havens where the giant shark's bulk became less effective. The rise of intelligent predators added another complication. Early orcas, smaller but highly cooperative, began to establish themselves as formidable hunters. Unlike Megalodon, which relied on overwhelming strength, these cetaceans coordinated their attacks through communication and strategy. Fossil evidence and studies of modern relatives suggest that pods work together to herd prey, isolate targets, and exhaust them before the kill. While no orca could challenge Megalodon alone, groups could interfere with its hunts, steal from its kills, or harass calves in ways that undercut its dominance. For the first time in millions of years, the ocean hosted predators whose power came not from size, but from collective intelligence. Amid these ecological shifts, climate continued its long, patient work. The spread of polar ice sheets drew down sea levels, reducing the shallow continental shelves where life had once flourished. These coastal zones, nurseries of abundance, shrank, forcing species into narrower ranges. Cold waters expanded their influence, pressing ecosystems into zones where adaptation was required for survival. The world was not collapsing, but it was tightening, and each tightening drew the line of survival close to the edge. Still, Megalodon endured. To imagine its life in this shifting ocean is to picture a predator that continued to inspire awe and fear, even as challenges grew. It swam vast distances, crossing entire oceans to follow migrations, its senses tuned to the faintest vibrations of whales moving leagues away. A single strike, when successful, could feed it for weeks, and in those weeks, smaller predators feasted on what it left behind. Its presence defined ecosystems. Whales adjusted migrations to avoid it. Dolphins refined their evasions, and scavengers thrived on the aftermath of its hunts. The shark was not merely part of the system, it was a force that shaped the entire system's rhythm. And yet, for all its grandeur, it was bound by fragility. Gigantism carries with it immense costs, energy requirements so vast that abundance must remain constant, vulnerability to any disruption in prey availability, and limited flexibility when prey patterns shift too far. In times of plenty, this gamble yields supremacy. In times of change, it becomes a weakness. Megalodon's dominance was not undone by any single rival or catastrophe, but by the slow erosion of conditions that had once made its reign inevitable. Picture a moment beneath the waves. A pod of whales moves along a cold current, their calves hidden within a wall of adult bodies. From below, the outline of Megalodon approaches, a shadow larger than any predator alive today. It circles, searching for weakness, testing the pod's defences. But the whales hold tight, their formation unbroken, their tails lashing the water in warning. Hours stretch, and the predator withdraws, the cost of energy outweighing the chance of success. It does not starve, not yet, but each failed strike adds weight to the scales. Where once abundance made the oceans generous, scarcity now made every hunt a calculation. The story of this age is one of tension, a ruler still in power but increasingly hemmed by the world it had once mastered. Megalodon still shaped ecosystems, still spread fear through every current, but the whispers of change were everywhere. In the cooling seas, in the growing whales, in the rise of intelligent hunters, and in the shrinking shallows, the future was gathering. The predator could not sense the slow tide of inevitability, but it swam within it all the same. As the Pliocene pressed forward, these forces did not relent. They deepened, hardened, and grew more unforgiving. The oceans were still vast, still alive with countless forms, but they no longer bent so easily to the will of a single giant. In this shifting balance, a question hung heavy in the depths. Could Megalodon adapt quickly enough to the new world forming around it, or was its reign already running out of time? The answer was still centuries away in the scale of the Earth, hidden in the movements of ice, the stirring of currents, and the slow expansion of whales into forms that dwarfed all others. For now, Megalodon remained, immense and magnificent, gliding silently through waters that no longer promised the certainty of tomorrow. By the mid-Pliocene, the seas had become a theatre of contrasts. On one horizon lay the memory of the Miocene's lush abundance, where warmth and productivity supported entire kingdoms of giants. On the other, the slow encroachment of cooling climates and shifting currents heralded a future less forgiving. Megalodon, still the undisputed apex predator of its age, patrolled oceans that no longer fully resembled the ones that had nurtured its rise. The giant shark's dominion persisted, but each year, each migration, and each subtle change in current carried the weight of questions about how long such supremacy could endure. The fossils of this time whisper stories of adaptation, of struggle, and of resilience tested. Along ancient coasts now uplifted into cliffs, enormous serrated teeth are still found, their edges sharp enough to suggest they were shed during hunts gone awry, or as natural replacements in jaws that never cease to grow new weapons. These teeth are not mere curiosities. They are fragments of an ongoing struggle for survival in a world that was beginning to tilt towards scarcity. Each tooth marks the presence of a predator that required entire ecosystems to feed it. Ecosystems that were shifting under the invisible pressure of global change. At the heart of this change were the whales. Their populations were not uniform. Some species flourished in the altered seas, while others dwindled. Baleen whales, particularly those that grew to unprecedented sizes, became both a blessing and a challenge for Megalodon. The sheer mass of such whales meant that a successful hunt could feed a giant shark for months. But size also meant danger. A strike on an adult blue whale ancestor, for instance, was an act of peril, for a single blow from a massive fluke could maim or kill even the largest predator. Megalodon's focus remained on calves and juveniles, but their protection within pods grew more sophisticated. Fossil evidence suggests that whales were evolving not only in size but in behaviour, travelling in coordinated groups, defending their young with collective force, and shifting calving grounds into colder, shallower waters that placed them just beyond the shark's most effective reach. This evolutionary arms race illustrates the delicate balance of the Pliocene seas. Megalodon's power was immense, Yet its prey was no longer passive. Each adaptation by whales forced corresponding changes in the predator's strategies, narrowing opportunities while increasing the cost of failure. In times of plenty, such dynamics could sustain balance. In times of scarcity, they turned survival into a gamble with stakes higher than ever before. Adding to this tension was the emergence of new competitors. Early orcas and other predatory cetaceans were refining the cooperative hunting strategies that would later make them dominant in modern seas. These animals were not rivals in size, but in intelligence and adaptability. Working in pods, they could disrupt Megalodon's hunts, steal from its kills, or harass it in ways that diminished its effectiveness. Though no single pod could overpower the giant, their presence introduced an element of unpredictability. A solitary predator, no matter how immense, is vulnerable when surrounded by smaller hunters acting with unity and cunning. The oceans themselves conspired against stability. The closure of the Central American Seaway reorganized currents across the globe, strengthening the Gulf Stream and amplifying climatic contrasts between hemispheres. This redirection of heat and salt shifted not only whale migrations, but also the productivity of entire regions. Waters that had once bloomed with plankton grew barren, while new regions became fertile corridors of life. For Megalodon, whose hunting success depended on following prey into these rich zones, such reorganization meant constant adjustment. The shark's vast body, designed for dominance in stable abundance, now faced the challenge of pursuing prey into waters where energy cost often outweighed gains. And yet, despite these mounting pressures, the image of Megalodon in this age remains one of awe. Imagine the shadow of such a predator rising beneath a pod of whales, the sea suddenly fractured by panic as calves were shielded in tight circles of protection. The shark would circle, test and probe, its eyes unblinking and ancient, its teeth glinting like blades against the light that filtered from above. The hunt was no longer a matter of brute force but of calculation, patience, precision, and risk measured against the narrowing margins of survival. This narrowing is the essence of the Pliocene for Megalodon. Giants always balance on the knife's edge of abundance, and as climates cooled, the knife grew thinner. Each decline in shallow coastal zones reduced nursery grounds for young whales and fish. Each expansion of cold currents forced migrations into harsher waters. The ocean was still alive, still beautiful, but it had become less generous. For smaller predators, this shift was an inconvenience. For Megalodon, it was a looming threat. Its very size, the crown of its evolution, became its greatest burden. Yet extinction was not imminent in this moment. Megalodon endured for hundreds of thousands of years within these changing seas. Its presence continued to shape the behavior of every species it encountered. Whales timed migrations to avoid it. Dolphins altered their evasive maneuvers, and scavengers continued to thrive on the remnants of its hunts. The predator still ruled, but the cracks in its dominion were visible, and each generation swam a little closer to the edge of a world no longer designed for giants. The fragility of this reign is best understood through the deep interplay of forces at work. Climate, currents, and prey were no longer aligned as they had been in the Miocene, and the predator that once seemed eternal was tethered to their shifts. The story of Megalodon in the mid-Pliocene is not one of collapse, but of tension. Tension between power and vulnerability, between dominance and dependence, between the grandeur of a species perfected for one world and the inevitability of that world slipping away. Picture the sea at dusk, its surface a mirror of fire as the sun sinks. Beneath, Megalodon glides in silence, its movements deliberate, its body a cathedral of muscle and memory. Above it, a pod of whales exhales, their breath rising in mist against the cooling sky. Between them lies an ancient conversation, one carried for millions of years, predator and prey, each shaping the other, each defining the balance of the seas. And though the predator still reigns, the silence carries a question. How long can such a balance last when the world itself is shifting beneath their fins? The oceans held the answer, not in sudden violence, but in the slow erosion of certainty. The ice continued its advance, the currents continued their reorganization, and life continued to adapt in ways that pressed against the edges of what giants could endure. Megalodon swam on, immense and indomitable in appearance, but the tides of change were already rising. They did not strike like a predator from the depths. They gathered like storms, distant yet inevitable, promising a future in which even the greatest shadow could not hold. By the late Pliocene, the seas were no longer the endless banquets they once had been. The great bloom of life that had sustained Megalodon through the Miocene and early Pliocene was beginning to waver, its rhythms reshaped by forces beyond the horizon of a predator's awareness. Ice continued to creep across the poles, locking away water, pulling down sea levels, and shrinking the wide coastal nurseries that had served as the foundation for marine abundance. In these shifting waters, Megalodon still ruled, but its supremacy rested on a balance that grew more precarious with each passing millennium. The evidence of these changes lingers in the fossils. Whales were growing into giants, many species expanding in size, dimensions that would one day culminate in the modern blue whale, the largest creature ever to exist on Earth. These vast bodies, swimming fortresses of fat and muscle, offered immense rewards for any predator daring enough to strike. Yet their very size, combined with the collective defense of pods, made them formidable. To attack an adult was to court ruin, forcing Megalodon into ever greater reliance on calves and juveniles. But calves were increasingly well protected, shielded by adults that coordinated their movements in defensive rings. A pod under attack was no longer just a cluster of individuals, but a unified wall of flesh and power, a living barricade against the predator that had once hunted with impunity. This shift represented not just an inconvenience, but a profound turning point in the evolutionary arms race. Whales, by tapping into the ocean's lowest trophic levels, krill and plankton, had built their success on resources far more resilient to change than megalodons. The shark, perched precariously at the very top of the food chain, depended entirely on these massive prey. If whales changed their habits, migrated to colder waters, or simply grew too large to be viable targets, the predators' options narrowed. Each adjustment by whales chipped away at the certainty of Megalodon's reign, leaving behind a ruler increasingly constrained by the very strategies that had once secured its dominance. The ocean offered new challenges in the form of predators that did not rely on size but on strategy. The ancestors of modern orcas, smaller but intelligent and social, were beginning to claim their own space in the marine hierarchy. In pods, they could coordinate hunts that rivaled even the efficiency of sharks. They learned to harass larger animals, to work together to exhaust prey, and perhaps even to challenge Megalodon indirectly by stealing its kills or disrupting its hunts. For a giant that hunted alone, such harassment was costly. Every failed strike meant energy lost, and energy was the one currency no giant could afford to squander. Meanwhile, environmental pressures deepened. With the Isthmus of Panama now fully sealed, ocean currents had permanently shifted. The Atlantic, saltier and warmer, drove currents northward that carried heat into polar regions, paradoxically fueling the growth of ice sheets through increased snowfall. These currents also altered the upwelling of nutrients, redistributing zones of productivity across the globe. For whales, this meant longer migrations into colder, nutrient-rich waters where food was plentiful. For Megalodon, the change was more ominous. To follow prey into such cold waters was possible, but the energy cost was high, and its massive body may not have been as efficient at maintaining warmth. Imagine the scene. A pod of whales enters subpolar waters, their massive bodies slicing through seas chilled by icebergs drifting from the poles. Calves swim closely within protective circles, their bodies shielded by adults that flank them like armoured guardians. From the shadows below, Megalodon rises, a vast form gliding silently upward. but as it approaches the whales tighten formation, their tails sweeping the water in warning arcs. The predator circles, its enormous jaws flexing in anticipation, yet no weakness appears. The cost of pressing further outweighs the potential reward. Reluctantly, the shark withdraws into the dark, defeated not by combat but by the growing efficiency of its prey's defense. Such scenes may have repeated countless times across the Pliocene, each one a small reminder that dominance is never eternal. A predator's supremacy relies on the vulnerability of others, and vulnerability was diminishing. The whales were not the only challenge. Dolphins grew faster and more cunning, their pods manoeuvring with acrobatic precision that left even the swiftest hunters frustrated. Other sharks filled niches that Megalodon's sheer size could not. Cooperative hunters claimed more scraps, nibbling away at its share of the ocean's wealth. Every element of the marine ecosystem was adjusting, not against Megalodon directly, but in ways that together undermined its dominion. And yet, in these same oceans, Megalodon remained a presence of awe. Its size alone set it apart as a living force of nature, a shadow that could silence an entire stretch of sea. Its jaws, capable of crushing bone with pressures beyond imagination, were still unmatched. Even as prey adapted, even as currents changed, the giant shark continued to thrive in pockets of abundance. Each successful kill fed not only the predator, but the entire food web around it. From seabirds plunging for scraps, to deep-sea scavengers feasting on whale falls, the echoes of Megalodon's hunts reverberated across the ecosystem. But beneath the grandeur, fragility deepened. The narrowing of hunting options, the rise of intelligent rivals, the spread of colder waters, and the shrinking of coastal nurseries formed threads of inevitability. To survive, Megalodon had to traverse greater distances, chase prey into harsher environments, and rely on fewer opportunities. Its life, once a rhythm of abundance, became one of endurance. The predator still reigned, but the crown it wore grew heavier, its brilliance dimmed by the shadows of change. The fossil record shows no single event of collapse, no catastrophic extinction in one stroke. Instead, it speaks of disappearance spread across time and space, a gradual fading of a species that had once ruled every ocean. In this lies a truth about dominance. It is not shattered but eroded, worn away by currents too vast for any creature to resist. Picture again the Pliocene seas at twilight. The horizon glows with the last fire of the sun, and beneath, Megalodon drifts through waters that have begun to betray it. Its massive body is still a marvel of design, its teeth still glinting like weapons from another age, yet the silence around it is telling. Prey is scarcer, defences stronger, rivals more cunning, and the seas themselves colder. The predator moves on, vast and unstoppable in appearance, yet carrying within it the weight of a world that no longer favours giants. The question now lingers like a shadow at the edge of vision. How long can a creature, even one perfected by evolution into such magnificence, endure when the very stage of its reign is being rewritten by forces it cannot control? The answer, as always, lies not in sudden violence but in the slow turning of Earth's cycles, and those cycles were only beginning to show their hand. The late Pliocene was a hinge in time, a threshold where the seas themselves seemed to hold their breath. Life continued, rich and varied. Yet the rhythms that had governed the oceans for millions of years now pulsed with unfamiliar irregularities. The balance between predator and prey, between warmth and cold, between abundance and scarcity, grew increasingly fragile. In this unsettled world, Megalodon still roamed as a shadow of unmatched power, yet even as it hunted, its future was being decided in silence, written by forces far larger than any one species could endure. The climate's steady cooling was more than a shift in temperature. It was a reordering of the Earth's systems. The spread of polar ice did not merely lower sea levels, it altered salinity, redirected currents, and tightened the cycles of productivity. In the North Atlantic, the strengthening of the Gulf Stream carried warm waters further north, driving snowfall that fed ice sheets. In the Pacific, currents reorganized, redistributing nutrients and reshaping ecosystems. Entire regions that had once flourished with plankton, the invisible foundation upon which all marine life rests, became less fertile. These changes rippled upward, first thinning fish populations, then pressuring the whales and dolphins that depended on them, and finally reaching Megalodon itself, the apex predator tethered to the abundance below. Whales, though still abundant, were no longer as vulnerable. Their bodies, grown larger through evolutionary pressure, served as fortresses. Their migrations, adapted to the shifting productivity of the seas, carried them into colder, nutrient-rich waters that tested the endurance of any predator following in pursuit. For Megalodon, such hunts were possible but costly. A giant shark's energy demands were immense, and each long chase into freezing waters drained more than it could afford to lose. To target calves remained the more efficient strategy, yet whales increasingly guarded their young with coordinated defences, forming protective walls that blunted the shark's assaults. This co-evolutionary struggle reveals the paradox at the heart of Megalodon's reign. Power shaped its prey, but the prey's responses in turn reshaped the predator's world. To remain dominant meant constant adjustment, and each adjustment chipped away at the ease of its supremacy. Where once a shadow rising from the depths could scatter a pod in panic, now the pod stood firm, its defences sharpened by generations of pressure. The predator was not diminished in size or strength, but in opportunity. Meanwhile, new hunters continued to carve their roles. Early orcas, smaller but social, tested the boundaries of cooperative intelligence. By working together, they could herd fish, exhaust seals, or isolate young whales. While they posed no direct existential threat to Megalodon, their presence altered the ecology of the seas. They competed for prey, disrupted hunts, and filled niches that had once been the giant shark's domain alone. Intelligence proved to be its own form of power, one that did not need size to tip balances. The fossil evidence hints at these dynamics in ways both subtle and profound. Whale bones from this period bear scars of predation. Gouges from teeth larger than a human hand, marks left by Megalodon's assaults. Yet these same bones also reveal survival. Healed wounds where whales escaped attacks, proof that the predator's success was never guaranteed. Such fossils tell a story not of invincible dominance, but of a constant, uncertain struggle where even the greatest hunter faced failure. And in this struggle, the stakes were immense. A single successful kill could sustain a Megalodon for weeks, but each failed attempt drained energy reserves that could not easily be replenished. For smaller predators, failure meant hunger. For Megalodon, it could mean collapse. Gigantism is a triumph of abundance, but in times of scarcity it becomes a trap. The very size that once ensured dominance now bound the predator to the mercy of increasingly unpredictable seas. Picture the late Pliocene ocean at dawn. The water glows with pale fire as the first light spills across the horizon. Beneath the surface, a pod of whales moves steadily northward, their breaths breaking the air in plumes of mist. Far below, Megalodon stirs, rising from the depths like a continent in motion. Its massive body is framed by silence, its eyes fixed on the vulnerable calf nestled within the pod. The predator ascends, jaws opening into a cathedral of serrated teeth. Yet as it nears, the pod tightens, adults flanking the calf in an impenetrable ring. The shark circles, probing, searching for weakness. Minutes stretch into hours, but the defense holds. Eventually, with energy waning, the predator drifts back into the blue. The calf survives. The giant moves on, undefeated but unfulfilled, carrying within it the weight of a changing world. Such moments repeated across oceans, quiet defeats that never left fossils but shaped the trajectory of an entire species. Success still came, but less often. Each failed strike, each defended calf, each migration into colder waters accumulated into pressures that gnawed at the predator's survival. Megalodon's reign persisted in presence but eroded in certainty. The broader ecosystem mirrored this fragility. Coastal habitats shrank as sea levels fell, stripping away nurseries that had once overflowed with life. Fish populations shifted with currents, scattering in new patterns that made their abundance less reliable. Seabirds adjusted their migrations, seals and sea lions carved their own spaces in the food web, and smaller sharks flourished in niches left unguarded. The ocean was not emptying, it was reorganizing, becoming a stage where adaptability mattered more than sheer size. Yet for all these pressures, Megalodon remained a marvel of existence. Its jaws could still crush whale bones with forces unmatched, its presence could still scatter pods into panic, and its teeth continued to rain down into sediments as reminders of its hunts. It was not defeated, not yet. Instead, it endured in a world that was slowly slipping beyond its design. Each tooth we find today, buried in cliffs or riverbeds, is not only a relic of power, but a testament to resilience. A predator holding its ground against tides of change that no creature could truly resist. The story of the late Pliocene is one of tension without resolution. Megalodon still swam, still ruled, still defined the balance of the seas. But beneath this dominance lay fragility, woven into every current, every migration, every subtle shift of climate. Giants endure only as long as the world sustains them, and the world of the Pliocene was reshaping itself into one less generous, less forgiving. As the epoch drew toward its close, the question deepened. How does supremacy end? Not with a single battle, not with a sudden collapse, but with the long, patient erosion of certainty. The seas were changing, and with them, the fate of the greatest shark ever to swim. The horizon darkened with inevitability, and though Megalodon still cast its shadow across every ocean, the silence beneath carried a truth too vast to ignore. The reign of giants was beginning to unravel, one tide at a time. As the Pliocene edged toward its end, the oceans became theatres of profound transition. The world was cooling more rapidly now, glaciers expanding across the poles, sea levels continuing their steady descent. Where once shallow seas spread wide across continental shelves, nurturing rich ecosystems of fish, turtles, and whales, coastlines withdrew, leaving bare expanses of rock and sediment exposed to the wind. For countless species, these changes were tests of adaptability. For Megalodon, a predator bound by its immense size to the rhythms of abundance, the tests grew sharper with every passing millennium. It is in this time that the contradictions of gigantism became most clear. Megalodon was still unmatched in power, its jaws capable of biting through the bones of whales, its shadow casting fear over entire pods. Yet its very enormity chained it to fragile certainties. It required vast amounts of prey, vast distances to roam, and seas filled with life rich enough to sustain its hunger. Each disruption, whether a shift in prey migration, a cooling of waters, or a decline in shallow nurseries, reverberated through its existence like cracks spreading through ice. Power was no shield against the invisible weight of ecological change. The whales, once the most vulnerable pieces in this balance, were now among the most resilient. They grew larger still, evolving into titans that dwarfed even Megalodon in sheer bulk. Their immense size, supported by filter-feeding strategies tied directly to the base of the food chain, gave them an advantage that the shark could never match. By feasting on krill and plankton, they tapped into a resource less volatile than the prey webs upon which Megalodon relied. To hunt such giants was possible, but dangerous and costly, turning each encounter into a gamble of survival rather than a certainty of conquest. For Megalodon, the focus narrowed further to calves, juveniles, and medium-sized whales that lacked the full defence of adults. Yet even these were becoming harder to claim. Pods grew increasingly adept at protective strategies. Calves were shielded in the centre of migrating groups, adults forming rings around them with tails that could batter any predator daring to break the wall. When threatened, pods moved in coordinated bursts, their unity blunting the solitary advantage of the shark. It was not that Megalodon lost its strength, it was that strength alone no longer guaranteed success. In this narrowing arena, new competitors sharpened their place in the hierarchy. The ancestors of modern killer whales had fully embraced cooperative hunting. Their intelligence and social behaviour turned them into predators, whose power derived from numbers and strategy. While they could not rival Megalodon in single combat, they did not need to. By targeting smaller prey, working as pods to exhaust their victims, and sometimes disrupting hunts of larger predators, they secured a growing share of the ocean's wealth. Where Megalodon was a singular force, orcas represented a new model, adaptability through cooperation. Their rise was not yet a usurpation, but it foreshadowed a future in which strategy would prove more enduring than sheer size. Meanwhile, the physical environment pressed its own relentless hand against the fate of giants. Cooling seas meant prey moved further into colder waters, where Megalodon's physiology may have struggled. As an ectothermic predator, its body heat regulated largely by surrounding waters, it may not have been able to hunt efficiently in the frigid zones where whales now thrived. Even if it could follow them, the energy costs of surviving in cold depths would have tested its limits. Each chase became more costly, each strike that failed more dangerous. In this sense, the environment itself was conspiring against giants, rewarding species with flexibility while punishing those bound by excess. And yet, in the face of mounting challenges, Megalodon's presence did not vanish overnight. Fossil evidence suggests it endured well into the Pliocene, perhaps brushing against the earliest edges of the Pleistocene. For millions of years it remained a figure of awe in the seas, its teeth still falling into sediments, its hunts still echoing through ecosystems. This persistence speaks not of sudden failure, but of a slow, tenacious endurance. Megalodon did not collapse in an instant. It resisted, holding on through centuries of diminishing abundance, a shadow that refused to fade easily. Imagine, then, a hunt near the close of the epoch. A young whale, separated slightly from its pod, moves through grey waters thick with chill. From the deep, Megalodon rises, its body moving with the inevitability of a storm. The strike is swift, brutal, efficient. The ocean fills with blood, and for weeks the predator is sustained. Around the carcass, smaller sharks arrive, tearing scraps from flesh. Seabirds circle overhead, and the deep sea floor will one day feast on the bones that fall into the abyss. The cycle remains intact, each death feeding countless lives. In this moment, Megalodon is still what it has always been, the apex predator, the sculptor of balance in the seas. But the very need for such rare opportunities underscores the fragility of its reign. A successful hunt was still possible, but less frequent. Prey was still abundant, but less accessible. The seas were still alive, but less forgiving. Each hunt carried more weight than ever before, and the margins between survival and failure narrowed. For a giant, such narrowing was perilous. The silence of the fossil record leaves much unknown. We cannot say with certainty how Megalodon responded to these challenges in its daily existence. Did it expand its range further than ever before, crossing oceans in desperate pursuit of prey? Did it risk colder waters more often, testing the limits of physiology against the pull of hunger? Did it grow leaner, smaller across generations as survival favoured those requiring less? Or did it persist, massive to the end, until scarcity finally erased it from the stage? These questions remain suspended in the silence of deep time, their answers hidden in layers of stone and sediment. What is clear is that the seas themselves were changing beyond recognition. The ecosystems that had nurtured Megalodon's rise were giving way to new patterns, new balances, new rulers. Giants, once the signature of abundance, were becoming rarer. Flexibility, intelligence, and cooperation were rising as the dominant strategies in a world where stability no longer reigned. The predator that had defined millions of years of marine history was swimming into an ocean less suited for giants and more suited for the adaptable. And so, the late Pliocene became the quiet prelude to the end of an age. Megalodon still swam, immense and unchallenged in appearance, but the silence of inevitability was closing around it. Its power had not diminished, but the world that sustained that power had moved on. Beneath the surface of the seas, the greatest predator to ever live carried within it the fading echoes of an empire, its shadow still vast, its presence still undeniable, but its future already slipping beyond its reach. The question lingered, as steady as the tide. Could a ruler of such magnificence endure when the seas themselves no longer bent to its needs? Or was the fate of giants always to vanish when abundance gave way to change? The answer was forming in the cold, in the currents and in the migrations of whales. Forces as unstoppable as time itself. The dawn of the Pleistocene was not marked by fire or sudden catastrophe, but by the quiet march of ice and the reshaping of seas. It was an epoch defined by glacial rhythms, immense sheets of ice advancing and retreating in cycles that spanned tens of thousands of years. These icy pulses dictated the level of the oceans, exposing continental shelves when sea levels dropped, then flooding them again as glaciers melted. For many creatures, such cycles offered both opportunity and peril. For Megalodon, it was a gauntlet that pressed its existence closer to the edge. The cooling of the earth during this time did not empty the seas of life, but it reordered them. Whales thrived in colder, nutrient-rich waters, their bodies growing even larger to conserve heat and exploit the vast fields of krill that flourished in polar zones. Dolphins and seals expanded into new ranges, adjusting their behaviour to survive the shifting boundaries of ice and sea. Fish populations shifted with currents, their abundance concentrated in upwellings tied to glacial cycles. Life persisted, abundant in places, scarce in others, but its distribution was no longer predictable. For a predator as large as Megalodon, which required not just prey but constancy of prey, this unpredictability was lethal. The giant shark's physiology may have been its greatest constraint in these new seas. While some sharks today, such as the great white, can elevate their body temperature through a process called regional endothermy, allowing them to endure colder waters, there is little evidence that Megalodon shared this adaptation. If it was limited to ectothermic regulation, its immense body would have been sluggish in frigid currents, less efficient in hunting, and more vulnerable to the costs of long pursuits. Even if it could enter cold zones, the energy trade-off was steep, and failure became more costly with each attempt. The whales it needed most had moved into environments where the predator was least effective. Imagine the scene. A vast pod of baleen whales moves along the edge of polar waters, their breath rising in ghostly plumes against a backdrop of drifting ice. They feed in abundance, their mouths sweeping krill from the frigid sea. Below, a megalodon rises cautiously, its body dark against the lighter water. It circles, testing the pod, but the cold grips its muscles, slowing its speed. The whales tighten their ranks, their calves protected at the centre. For hours the predator lingers, each moment a drain of energy, until finally it drifts back into deeper, warmer waters. The pod remains unbroken, and the predator swims away, a shadow weighed down by the limits of its biology. The rise of intelligent, cooperative predators in these same oceans only deepened the challenge. Early orcas, with their social structures and coordinated hunting techniques, became formidable rivals in ecological terms. They did not need to challenge Megalodon directly to weaken its dominance. By working together, they could control prey populations, harass vulnerable calves, and even steal from the kills of larger predators. Where Megalodon hunted alone, depending on brute force, orcas relied on strategy and collaboration. The contrast between solitary gigantism and cooperative cunning foreshadowed the oceans to come. Meanwhile, the shrinking of coastal habitats further eroded Megalodon's strength. During glacial periods, sea levels could drop by hundreds of feet, exposing vast continental shelves that had once been shallow, fertile nurseries. These areas, where fish spawned and young whales often calved, were critical to the abundance that sustained giants. With each glacial advance, such habitats shrank, forcing life into narrower corridors. For smaller, more adaptable species, this contraction was survivable. For Megalodon, whose range and food demands stretched across oceans, it was yet another tightening of the noose. And yet, despite these mounting challenges, Megalodon did not vanish instantly. Fossil evidence suggests it may have lingered into the early Pleistocene, overlapping with some of the first glacial cycles. Its presence was still felt in the fear it inspired, in the scars it left on whale bones, and in the immense teeth it shed into sediments. It remained a predator of legend, even as the conditions that had birthed it slipped further away. That persistence speaks to its resilience, a species finely tuned to dominance, enduring as long as possible even in a world that was no longer its own. But survival in these times was no longer about grandeur. It was about endurance, and endurance favoured the adaptable. Whales fed directly from the ocean's base, ensuring their continuity. Orcas hunted together, turning intelligence into a weapon. Smaller sharks diversified into countless niches, thriving where giants faltered. Seals and sea lions colonized coasts, their presence shaping entire ecosystems. The oceans of the Pleistocene were alive and abundant, but they had no place for rulers who required constancy. They rewarded the flexible, the cooperative, the efficient. Megalodon's disappearance was not marked by a single event, but by the slow layering of pressures. The cooling seas, the shrinking nurseries, the rise of rivals, the evolution of prey, the sheer cost of being a giant. Its extinction was not a collapse, but an erasure, the gradual fading of a shadow once cast across every ocean. One by one, the conditions that had sustained it were withdrawn, until at last the giant passed into memory, leaving behind only its monumental teeth as echoes of its reign. Picture the final centuries of its existence, the shark still swimming vast distances, still rising from the depths in ambush, still crushing bones with its jaws, each successful hunt a triumph, each failure a reminder of how thin the line had become. Perhaps some individuals survived longer than others, in warmer waters where prey remained abundant. Perhaps calves still grew into giants, their teeth still raining down into sediments. But the trend was irreversible. The ice advanced, the seas shifted, and the giants dwindled until none remained. And so the Pleistocene inherited the oceans not from Megalodon, but from the survivors of its passing. Whales continued their march toward gigantism. Orcas refined their intelligence into dominance. Smaller sharks diversified further, and seals and dolphins carved their own legacies. The seas did not grow empty when Megalodon vanished. They grew different, reshaped by the absence of a predator that had once defined their balance. What lingers now is the question of memory. In cliffsides where ancient seas once lapped, we find the teeth of Megalodon, larger than a human hand, edges serrated like blades of stone. We hold them as relics, but also as mirrors, reflecting the truth that even the mightiest are bound to the fragility of their world. The predator that ruled for millions of years did so not because it was eternal, but because the world once allowed it. When the world changed, so too did its fate. The silence left in its absence is not empty. It is filled with echoes, the cry of whales breaking the surface, the chatter of dolphins weaving through waves, the calculated hunts of orcas slicing through prey. These sounds are the inheritance of an ocean that once belonged to giants, an inheritance built on the shifting balance of survival. And beneath that inheritance, the shadow of Megalodon lingers, not as a living presence, but as a question. How does power endure when the very stage of its existence erodes? How long can even the greatest predator stand against the patient turning of Earth's cycles? In the chill of the Pleistocene, the oceans carried their answer, and it was written not in battles, but in silence. By the time the Pleistocene advanced into its deeper rhythms, the seas bore little resemblance to those of the Miocene that had once nourished Megalodon's rise. The Earth had become a planet of cycles, its climate swinging between long glacial periods and shorter interglacial reprieves. Ice sheets thickened, then retreated, then thickened again, carving valleys, redrawing coastlines, and dictating the life of oceans in pulses of cold and warmth. Each cycle reshaped the world's ecosystems, pressing every species to adapt or perish. For Megalodon, these relentless oscillations proved unforgiving, stripping away the stability that giants required. During glacial maxima, when ice gripped the poles and sea levels dropped dramatically, shallow coastal nurseries, the cradles of marine abundance, shrank or disappeared altogether. These zones had once teemed with fish, seals and young whales, providing the resources upon which Megalodon thrived. Without them, prey populations contracted, scattered across narrower ranges, and became harder to predict. When sea levels rose again in interglacial periods, habitats returned, but never in the same form. The continual cycle of loss and return fractured the reliability of food webs, and for a predator that required immense consistency, such fluctuations were devastating. Whales, however, adapted with remarkable resilience. Their filter-feeding strategies, built on harvesting krill and plankton, allowed them to flourish in nutrient-rich polar waters. Evolution drove them to even greater sizes, their immense bodies conserving heat and exploiting prey that was more stable across glacial cycles. Their migrations became longer, their social strategies more complex, and their defensive behaviours more sophisticated. Megalodon could still attack calves, but pods worked tirelessly to shield them, forming barricades of muscle and tail flukes that transformed a vulnerable young whale into a fortress of collective will. Each adaptation by whales narrowed the opportunities for the giant shark, forcing it to expend greater energy for smaller rewards. The rise of cooperative predators sharpened the edges of this struggle. Orcas, refining their pod-based strategies, thrived in the new oceans. By communicating, coordinating, and working together, they exploited niches inaccessible to Megalodon. They hunted fish, seals, and smaller whales with efficiency, often targeting prey that the giant shark ignored. At times, they likely harassed Megalodon itself, disrupting its hunts or stealing portions of its kills. The shark's sheer size meant no pod could kill it directly, but the cumulative effect of interference weakened its dominance. Power was no longer measured only by physical size. Intelligence and adaptability were becoming the currencies of survival. Even smaller sharks flourished in these shifting seas. Great whites, cousins descended from earlier lineages, demonstrated flexibility that Megalodon lacked. They could hunt in colder waters, adapt to different prey, and survive on smaller meals. Their range expanded as Megalodons narrowed, and though they were not direct rivals in scale, their rise foreshadowed a future in which sharks would dominate by diversity, rather than by singular gigantism. The seas, in essence, were redistributing power, favouring species that bent with change instead of those that demanded constancy. Picture a Pleistocene hunt in this new world. A pod of whales feeds in subpolar waters, their bodies immense, their songs echoing across the depths. Megalodon rises from below, its shadow vast, its jaws opening in anticipation of a strike. The whales tighten, calves at the centre, adults on the perimeter. The predator circles, lunges, and tests their formation. Flukes crash through the water like battering rams driving it back. Minutes turn to hours, and the predator's energy wanes in the cold. At last, it withdraws, its hunger unquenched. From a distance, orcas circle the periphery, their whistles sharp, their pods ready to exploit scraps if the balance breaks. The ocean remains alive with predators, but the advantage has shifted from the solitary giant to the cooperative hunters. The fossil record hints at this gradual erosion of dominance. Whale bones from the early Pleistocene still bear the scars of Megalodon's teeth, proof that the shark endured and hunted even as challenges grew. But such evidence becomes scarcer in younger sediments. By around 2.5 million years ago, Megalodon's trail begins to vanish, its once global distribution reduced to silence. Its disappearance is not a single moment, but a drawn-out fading, a vanishing act stretched across centuries. To paleontologists, this slow erasure speaks of extinction by attrition, the relentless compounding of ecological pressures that giants could not outlast. And yet, the image of Megalodon in these final ages is not one of weakness, but of persistence. Even in decline, it remained a predator of awe-inspiring force, capable of strikes that could feed entire ecosystems with a single kill. Each tooth it shed was still larger than any shark's today, each hunt still capable of shaping the behaviour of prey. Its reign was waning, but not erased. To live in those times was to swim in seas where Megalodon's shadow still loomed, even as the horizon closed in. The lessons of its decline echo beyond its extinction. Giants are born in times of abundance, but abundance is rarely eternal. The Earth's cycles of climate, the shifting of continents, the rise of new predators, and the evolution of prey all conspire against permanence. Megalodon's story is not unique. It is a chapter in the broader truth that dominance, no matter how overwhelming, is fragile when the foundations beneath it shift. Dinosaurs, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, each in their time wore the crown of supremacy, and each in turn was undone by the silent turning of Earth's rhythms. Still, there is something uniquely haunting in Megalodon's end. Unlike sudden catastrophes that erase species in fire or ice, its disappearance was gradual, like a tide withdrawing from shore. For millions of years, it had been the architect of fear, the sculptor of marine balance. Its absence left a vacancy, not in the number of species, but in the imagination of the seas. The oceans did not grow barren when Megalodon vanished. They grew quieter, their hierarchies reshaped around predators that thrived through cunning rather than sheer size. Picture the last echoes of its presence. In warm coastal waters, perhaps a lone Megalodon glided along a shelf, its body immense but its world diminished. Fewer whales passed through, their migration shifting away. Coastal nurseries were shallower, colder, less abundant. Smaller sharks darted in packs, orcas whistled in distant pods, and the ocean itself seemed less generous. The predator still moved with power, but each beat of its fins carried the weight of a vanishing world. Within centuries, a blink in geological time, the shadow that had stretched across oceans for millions of years was gone. The Pleistocene seas moved forward without pause. Whales continued to expand their reign as the largest animals ever known. Orcas refined their cooperative hunts into dominance that persists today. Great whites rose to fill niches left open, embodying the adaptability that had eluded their colossal cousin. The oceans did not mourn Megalodon's passing, they simply adapted, as they always have. Yet the silence it left is one that lingers in the human imagination, a reminder of both the grandeur of nature and its relentless impermanence. And so, the story of Megalodon in the Pleistocene is one of endurance pressed to its limits, of a ruler holding on in a world that had already moved past giants. Its teeth remain scattered across the earth as silent monuments, relics of a time when the seas trembled under its presence. To hold one is to hold not just the memory of a predator, but the truth of survival, that power is fleeting, and that even the greatest must yield when the Earth decides to turn the page. The extinction of Megalodon was not an event etched in fire or cataclysm, but a slow erasure that unfolded across millennia, hidden beneath the steady turning of Earth's cycles. By the later Pleistocene, the giant shark had disappeared, leaving behind only scattered teeth and broken vertebrae as whispers of its reign. Yet the question of why it vanished remains one of paleontology's most compelling mysteries. Scientists have sought answers in the currents of climate, the strategies of prey, the rise of rivals, and the very biology of gigantism itself. The story of Megalodon's end is a mosaic of possibilities, each piece revealing part of the truth, but none standing alone. One of the most enduring theories ties its extinction to climate change. As ice ages intensified, sea levels fell and rose in long, dramatic cycles. When glaciers advanced, shallow coastal nurseries, warm, sheltered waters where Megalodon likely bore its young, shrank or vanished. These nurseries had been essential, protecting juveniles from larger predators and ensuring access to smaller prey during their vulnerable early years. Without them, survival rates would have plummeted. Adults may have endured for a time, but without the steady replenishment of new generations, the species could not persist. In this sense, the slow withdrawal of seas may have erased Megalodon's future long before it erased its present. Another factor lies in the changing fortunes of whales, the shark's primary prey. As climate cooled, many whale species adapted by migrating into colder, nutrient-rich waters near the poles. There, they thrived on immense swarms of krill, building populations that would one day sustain the giants of our own time, such as the blue whale. But these icy zones were less accessible to Megalodon, whose physiology likely limited its ability to hunt efficiently in frigid seas. If it pursued whales into such waters, the energy cost was steep and failure more likely. If it stayed in warmer ranges, prey grew scarcer. The very success of whales in adapting to new environments may have outpaced the predator that once controlled them. At the same time, whales were evolving new defences. Social behaviour became a survival tool, pods coordinating to protect calves with remarkable precision. Larger body sizes reduced vulnerability, making adults almost untouchable. The scars on fossilized whale bones tell a dual story. Deep gouges from Megalodon's serrated teeth, but also healed wounds where prey had escaped. Such evidence suggests that hunts grew more difficult and survival more costly. For a predator requiring enormous amounts of food, even a modest decline in hunting success could tip the scales toward collapse. The rise of intelligent competitors added yet another layer to this struggle. Early orcas and other predatory cetaceans expanded their presence during the Pleistocene, carving a niche in the seas through cooperation. They did not need to rival Megalodon in size. Their strength lay in numbers and strategy. Pods could isolate prey, harass calves, and overwhelm defences through coordination. While they may not have driven Megalodon directly to extinction, their growing role in marine ecosystems likely eroded its dominance. Where once the giant shark had ruled unchallenged, it now shared seas with predators that hunted differently, more flexibly, and with increasing efficiency. Smaller sharks, too, claimed ground in the wake of ecological change. Great whites, in particular, thrived as adaptable hunters, capable of surviving on diverse prey and enduring colder waters. Some scientists suggest they may have competed directly with juvenile megalodons, whose smaller size made them vulnerable to predation and competition alike. If young sharks struggled to find food or safety, the population would have suffered at its roots. The very flexibility that allowed smaller sharks to flourish highlighted the rigidity of Megalodon's ecological role. Giants are specialists, and specialists suffer when the stage changes. Beyond ecological pressures, the biology of Megalodon itself may have set limits on its endurance. Gigantism carries immense energy demands. Estimates suggest an adult Megalodon may have needed over a ton of food every day to sustain itself. In times of abundance, such a requirement was manageable, even advantageous. But in times of fluctuation, when prey was scattered, defended, or absent, the burden became unsustainable. Each hunt carried higher stakes, each failure a sharper cost. In this way, its very magnificence became its undoing. A body built for dominance in stable abundance could not bend when stability dissolved. Still, the disappearance of Megalodon was not abrupt. Fossil evidence suggests it persisted for millions of years into the Pliocene, perhaps even brushing against the earliest Pleistocene. For a time, it endured alongside shifting ecosystems, its hunt still shaping the behaviour of whales, its presence still echoing through the seas. Its extinction was not a collapse, but a fading. Individuals lived, hunted, and died, their teeth sinking into sediments even as the species dwindled. The silence of its vanishing lies in this gradual process, a decline so stretched across time that no single moment can be marked as its end. Picture those final centuries. In warmer waters, a lone Megalodon drifts through seas no longer filled with certainty. It still rises in ambush, still seizes prey with a strike that shakes the ocean, but such victories are rare. More often, pods evade or repel it, or prey migrates into colder zones it cannot follow. Around it, smaller predators thrive. Orcas in coordinated pods, great whites darting in colder currents, dolphins weaving through schools of fish. The shark remains a shadow of awe, yet its world grows thinner, its dominion dimmed not by a single rival, but by the cumulative weight of change. The oceans, however, didn't mourn. Life reshaped itself as it always does. Whales expanded further, their gigantism unchallenged in Megalodon's absence. Orcas refined their cooperative strategies, inheriting the role of apex predator in many seas. Great whites rose into dominance as versatile hunters, their reign enduring into our present day. The balance of power shifted, but the system endured. The disappearance of one giant did not collapse the ocean. It restructured it, proving that even the absence of the greatest predator cannot halt the persistence of life. For humanity, the story of Megalodon lingers not in memory but in imagination. We did not walk the earth when it swam, yet we inherit the silence it left. Its teeth, scattered in cliffs and riverbeds, remind us of a creature so vast it bent ecosystems around its hunger. They remind us too that no supremacy is eternal. The earth changes, climates shift, ecosystems evolve, and even the mightiest vanish. To hold a Megalodon tooth today is to touch a fragment of power, but also a fragment of fragility, a symbol of how even nature's grandest experiments must yield to time. The extinction of Megalodon is not just a story of loss, it is a story of transformation. The oceans did not grow weaker in its absence, they grew different. New predators rose, prey adapted, and the balance of life carried forward. But the silence left by its vanishing is profound, a reminder of impermanence, of how even giants cannot resist the tide of change. Its story endures not as tragedy, but as testament. The sea is larger than any ruler, and time erases even the greatest shadows. And in that silence, a question still stirs, as steady as the rhythm of waves. What, in our own age, are the giants we take for granted, believing them eternal? And when the earth turns again, as it always does, which shadows will vanish into memory, leaving only fragments behind? When Megalodon slipped into extinction, the oceans did not pause. They moved on, as they always do, filling the void with new arrangements of power and survival. Yet the shadow of the giant lingered, not in the living seas of the Pleistocene, but in the silence it left behind. With its disappearance, ecosystems reorganized. Whales expanded into niches once constrained by predation. Smaller sharks diversified into roles once dominated by a single apex giant, and cooperative hunters like orcas rose into prominence. The fall of Megalodon was not an end, but a transition, an inflection point in the long narrative of marine life. Whales, freed from the constant threat of Megalodon, may have undergone one of the most profound expansions in size in all of natural history. The blue whale, the largest animal ever to live on Earth, grew to length surpassing 100 feet, its body dwarfing even the legendary predator that once pursued its ancestors. Without Megalodon to keep populations in check, baleen whales flourished, their migratory routes lengthening, their social structures evolving. The very giants that had once been prey became architects of new ecosystems. Their carcasses, when they fell into the depths, became whale falls, sustaining communities of scavengers for decades. These ecosystems of death, once tied to the hunts of Megalodon, now blossomed from the natural lives and deaths of whales themselves, feeding the abyss in new rhythms. The rise of orcas cemented another legacy of change. These smaller, intelligent predators inherited the mantle of cooperative dominance. While they did not grow into giants, their cunning allowed them to dominate in ways Megalodon never could. Orcas could adapt diets, learn from each other, and pass hunting techniques across generations. One pod might specialize in hunting seals, another in fish, another in calves of whales. This cultural diversity within a species gave them an edge in a world where adaptability meant survival. Where Megalodon's power was blunt and immense, orcas wielded strategy and intelligence as tools of supremacy. The future of apex predation belonged not to giants, but to thinkers. Smaller sharks, too, once overshadowed by Megalodon's enormity, flourished in its absence. The great white shark, in particular, rose into prominence. Though far smaller than Megalodon, great whites inherited similar strategies of ambush, speed, and jaw strength. They became efficient hunters across colder waters and diverse ecosystems, thriving where their colossal cousin could not. Today, their reputation as the ocean's most fearsome shark echoes faintly of Megalodon, but their dominance lies not in sheer size, but in flexibility. In them, the ocean favoured the versatile over the monumental. These shifts remind us that extinction does not create emptiness, it creates opportunity. When the apex predator vanished, the sea did not collapse into imbalance. Instead, it redistributed power. Prey species like whales expanded, predators like orcas and great whites diversified, and entire food webs recalibrated. The oceans did not grieve Megalodon's loss. They reshaped themselves around it, as they have done with every extinction since life began. And yet, the legacy of Megalodon endures in ways that ripple beyond biology. Its teeth, massive and serrated, remain scattered across the world, embedded in cliff sides, hidden in riverbeds, or clutched in the hands of fossil hunters. These relics are more than stone. They are the fragments of a story that speaks to both awe and fragility. To hold a Megalodon tooth is to feel the weight of a predator that once commanded every sea, and at the same time to realize that such power could vanish. It is a reminder that no supremacy is eternal, that even giants must bend to the slow will of Earth's changes. The myths born from these relics only amplify its shadow. For centuries, before science named and described the shark, its teeth were thought to be dragon's tongues or petrified serpents. They were carried as talismans, symbols of strength and mystery. Even today, the cultural fascination with Megalodon endures. Movies, novels, and documentaries portray it as a lurking monster, a possibility that it might still hide in the depths. These myths reflect not the science of its extinction, but the human refusal to let go of giants. We're drawn to the idea that something so vast and terrible could still exist, waiting in the deep. But the truth is both more humbling and more profound. Megalodon does not need to survive in myth to prove its greatness. Its true legacy lies in the very structure of the oceans it left behind. Whales as titans of the seas, orcas as cooperative hunters, great whites as agile apex predators, Each of these is in some way a child of Megalodon's absence. Its extinction created space for new forms of power, and those forms define the seas we know today. The ocean as it exists now is, in part, a monument to what vanished. Picture the ocean at present. A blue whale surfaces, its immense body dwarfing even ships that pass nearby. Orcas work in pods, corralling seals with tactics passed from mother to calf. Great whites patrol temperate coasts, their shadows reminding us of the primal fear sharks inspire. Each of these scenes is modern, yet each carries the echo of the giant that once shaped the seas. The balance that sustains them was forged in part by the absence of Megalodon, its shadow cast not in presence, but in memory. Extinction, in this light, is not only an end, but a transformation. The disappearance of Megalodon demonstrates the fragility of dominance and the resilience of life. Its story is a lesson written in stone and water, that power, no matter how immense, must eventually yield. The Earth's cycles do not preserve rulers, they create and erase them in rhythm with climate, geology, and time. Giants appear, rule, and vanish, leaving behind legacies that shape what comes next, and yet the fascination endures. We are haunted by the silence of the seas where Megalodon once swam, not because we believe it waits in the depths, but because its story touches something deep within us, the realization that even the strongest are not immune to change. In Megalodon's vanishing, we see reflected the impermanence of power, the inevitability of loss, and the grandeur of a world that never ceases to transform. The oceans did not forget Megalodon. They carry its memory in every whale that breaks the surface, in every predator that prowls the deep, and in every fossil washed up on shore. Its shadow lingers not as a monster waiting in the abyss, but as a reminder of the balance between abundance and fragility. To speak of Megalodon is to speak of the oceans themselves, vast, powerful, and forever in motion. And so, as the seas continued without it, the silence of its absence asked a question that echoes still. What other giants, living now, will vanish when the earth turns again? The answer waits in the cycles of climate, in the migrations of species, in the shifting of currents, the same forces that once closed the chapter on Megalodon. The lesson is as eternal as the tides. The sea does not hold still for kings. It crowns them, sustains them, and in time erases them, leaving only shadows and stone. Long after Megalodon's shadow faded from the oceans, its legacy continued to ripple through the fabric of life. Extinction does not erase, it transforms. The predator's absence reshaped ecosystems, leaving behind traces written not only in fossils, but in the very behaviours and adaptations of those that survived. To understand this legacy is to look not at what was lost, but at what rose in the silence of its vanishing. The oceans of the late Pleistocene and beyond tell that story, a world no longer dominated by giants of tooth and muscle, but by resilience, intelligence, and the power of adaptation. Whales carried the most visible legacy. Freed from the constant pressure of a predator that once stalked them relentlessly, they expanded in both size and range. Evolution drove them toward extremes, culminating in the blue whale, the largest animal ever to live. At more than 100 feet long, it eclipsed even Megalodon's monumental form. Its survival strategy was not speed, not aggression, but sheer mass and a reliance on krill, tiny crustaceans that bloomed in staggering numbers in cold, nutrient-rich waters. In a twist of evolutionary irony, the largest animal in history sustains itself on some of the smallest prey. This path, however, was only possible because Megalodon no longer reigned. Without the constant shadow of ambush, whales could grow larger, their migrations stretching across entire oceans without fear of being culled by a predator that specialized in striking the vulnerable. Orcas, too, flourished in this restructured ocean. Their cooperative strategies, refined through generations, allowed them to occupy the niche of apex predator with remarkable success. Where Megalodon had hunted alone, orcas hunted as families, using communication, planning, and shared learning to outmaneuver prey. They displayed cultural diversity in their hunting techniques, with pods developing unique methods, beaching themselves temporarily to seize seals, or coordinating attacks to overwhelm larger whales. Such adaptability made them not only survivors but inheritors of a role once defined by brute force. They demonstrated that power in the ocean no longer required sheer size, but the ability to think, to cooperate, and to pass knowledge forward. Great whites, cousins of Megalodon, rose as well. Though only a fraction of its size, they inherited aspects of its predatory design: serrated teeth, muscular bodies, and ambush strategies. Unlike Megalodon, however, they could thrive on smaller prey, adapt to colder waters, and sustain themselves across diverse environments. Their flexibility made them the heirs of shark dominance in a world that no longer tolerated gigantism. They became symbols of fear in their own right, their reputation magnified by human imagination, yet their success was rooted in the same principle that doomed their colossal ancestor. Adaptability outweighs size when climates shift. The absence of Megalodon also reshaped the very structure of marine ecosystems. With whales no longer under constant pressure, populations expanded. Larger numbers meant more frequent whale falls, the sinking of carcasses to the deep sea, where they created ecosystems of astonishing complexity. Entire communities of worms, mollusks, crustaceans, and bacteria evolved to exploit this sudden abundance of nutrients. These ecosystems, thriving for decades on a single whale fall, became one of the deep ocean's greatest sources of stability. Where once Megalodon had mediated whale populations through predation, the balance now came from the natural cycles of life and death. But Megalodon's disappearance also carries a cautionary tale about the fragility of giants. Evolution produces monumental creatures when abundance allows it, but abundance is never permanent. Climate shifts, tectonic upheavals, and the rise of competitors all conspire against permanence. In this, Megalodon's fate mirrors that of other giants across Earth's history. The sauropod dinosaurs that once shook the ground with their steps, the mammoths that roamed frozen steppes, the saber-toothed cats whose fangs defined an age. Each rose in times of plenty and fell when the world no longer favoured their form. The ocean did not single Megalodon out. It followed the same rule that governs all life: adapt or vanish. And yet, in vanishing, Megalodon became larger than life. Its myth outgrew its bones, shaping human imagination long after the seas forgot its presence. For centuries its teeth were misunderstood, believed to be relics of dragons or petrified tongues of serpents. Even now myths persist that it survives in hidden depths, a leviathan lurking beyond the reach of sonar. These stories reflect our fascination with what is vast, our unwillingness to let go of the idea that something so monumental could truly disappear. To imagine Megalodon still swimming is to imagine that the ocean holds secrets too large for discovery, an idea that comforts and terrifies in equal measure. Yet reality, in its quiet way, is even more profound. Megalodon's extinction reveals not only the impermanence of power, but also the creativity of life in response to loss. The oceans did not collapse when the giant fell. They adapted, redistributing dominance into forms less monumental, but more resilient. The predator's absence shaped the seas as surely as its presence once did. In the absence, whales grew larger, orcas grew smarter, and sharks grew more flexible. Its legacy is not just in fossils, but in the very fabric of marine life that followed. Imagine a modern ocean scene. A blue whale breaches, its body so vast that it seems to carry the memory of Megalodon's shadow within its own bulk. Nearby, orcas hunt with precision, corralling prey in tactics as refined as any human military maneuver. Beneath the waves, a great white circles, its serrated teeth glinting in the light, a smaller echo of its vanished cousin. Each of these creatures, in their form and behaviour, carries a trace of the giant that once ruled. The ocean remembers, not with monuments, but with living legacies. For us, Megalodon's story is both inspiration and warning. It shows the grandeur of life when conditions align to create a creature beyond imagination, but also the fragility of such grandeur in the face of change. Its extinction is a reminder that no power, no matter how absolute it seems, is permanent. The earth does not preserve rulers. It cycles through them, sculpting new forms as old ones fade. Megalodon's reign was long, its dominance unmatched, but in the end it was subject to the same truth as all life. Survival belongs to the adaptable. And so the legacy of Megalodon is not only in the teeth we find, or the myths we tell, but in the balance of the seas today. Its story lives on in the giants that swim where it once hunted, in the predators that hunt with intelligence rather than size, and in the silence it left behind. To remember Megalodon is not to mourn its loss, but to recognize the rhythm of nature, a rhythm that builds giants, erases them, and begins again. The sea moves forward, always. Its tides do not wait for kings. Its currents erase shadows, even those cast by the greatest predator ever to live. Yet in that erasure lies continuity, and in continuity lies the truth of life itself, that nothing endures forever, but everything leaves its mark. Megalodon's mark is vast, written across fossils, across ecosystems, and across the very imagination of humankind. To speak of it now is to speak not of a monster, but of a reminder that the ocean, like time, belongs to no ruler, and crowns only those who can endure its endless change. The silence that followed Megalodon's extinction was not emptiness, but a rearrangement of the ocean's chorus. Life continued to sing in countless voices, yet one note was missing: the deep, thunderous presence of the largest shark to have ever lived. Its absence was felt not only in the lives of whales, dolphins, and other predators, but in the very architecture of ecosystems. Without Megalodon, the balance of fear shifted. Whales expanded their migrations without the constant threat of ambush. Orcas grew into cooperative rulers of the seas, and smaller sharks filled niches once overshadowed by the giant. The oceans of the Pleistocene and beyond were transformed, carrying within them the legacy of a predator that had shaped them for millions of years. To appreciate this transformation, one must imagine the ocean as a vast network of connections, a web of energy flowing from plankton to fish, from fish to whales, and from whales to scavengers in the depths. Megalodon had been a regulator of this system, pruning populations of whales and other large marine animals, ensuring no single group grew unchecked. Its disappearance disrupted that regulation. Whales surged in numbers, and with them came a new rhythm of life and death. When whales died naturally, their immense bodies sank into the abyss, creating whale fall ecosystems. These oases of the deep supported communities of worms, mollusks, and bacteria for decades, even centuries. In the absence of Megalodon's predation, whale falls became more frequent, feeding the deep in ways that reshaped entire ecosystems. The predator's absence, paradoxically, created abundance for life far below the waves. Orcas, with their intelligence and cooperation, inherited much of the role Megalodon once played. Though far smaller, their ability to strategize allowed them to dominate prey in ways the giant could not. Pods specialized in different techniques. Some hunted fish, others seals, others calves of whales. In their diversity, they were more flexible than Megalodon had ever been. They could shift prey as conditions changed, adjusting to scarcity in ways that giants never could. Their success was not measured in size but in adaptability, and in this they embodied the future of apex predation. Great whites too rose in prominence, embodying a different legacy. They were echoes of Megalodon's design, serrated teeth for shearing flesh, muscular bodies built for bursts of speed, ambush strategies perfected over millions of years. But unlike their colossal cousin, they did not require tons of food each day. They could survive on smaller prey, thrive in colder waters, and range across the globe without the burden of gigantism. In them, the ocean chose not excess, but efficiency. They became, in time, the sharks most feared by humans, their image tangled with the memory of Megalodon itself. And yet the fascination with Megalodon did not end with its extinction. Its teeth, buried in sediments and cliffsides, became artifacts of mystery. Early humans who encountered them did not see sharks but dragons, sea monsters, or petrified tongues of serpents. These interpretations reveal something profound about human imagination. We are drawn to the colossal, to the notion of creatures so vast they seem to defy comprehension. Megalodon entered myth before it entered science, its fossils transformed into symbols long before paleontology gave it a name. When science did uncover its true nature, the fascination only deepened. To imagine a shark 60 feet long, jaws wide enough to engulf a human whole, is to confront a scale that humbles our place in nature. Even today, despite knowing it is extinct, whispers of its survival persist in popular culture. Films, novels, and speculation ask, what if it still lurks in the abyss? Could a predator so vast remain hidden in the unexplored depths of the ocean? These myths thrive not because evidence supports them, but because the human mind resists the finality of extinction. To imagine Megalodon still alive is to imagine that the world still holds mysteries too immense to tame. Yet the reality, though less sensational, is far more meaningful. Megalodon's extinction was not failure, but inevitability. The cost of gigantism in a world that shifted beneath its fins. Climate cooled, seas reorganized, whales adapted, rivals rose, and the balance tilted away from giants. The oceans chose flexibility over enormity, strategy over brute force. Megalodon's reign ended not because it was weak, but because the stage itself transformed. This truth carries echoes into our own time, reminding us that no ruler, no matter how dominant, escapes the cycles of change. Imagine standing on a modern shoreline, the surf breaking softly against the sand. To the untrained eye, the sea appears timeless, its horizon endless. Yet beneath those waves lies a memory. The whales breaching in the distance are heirs to freedoms gained in Megalodon's absence. The orcas patrolling in pods embody strategies that outlive giants. The sharks that circle quietly below carry fragments of the predator's design, sharpened into forms the world could sustain. The ocean you see is not just present, it is history, shaped by what vanished as much as by what remains. And in this history lies a mirror. Megalodon's story is not only about the fate of a shark, but about the rhythm of life itself. Dominance is always temporary, tied to conditions that never hold still. Abundance fosters giants, but scarcity reclaims them. Intelligence, adaptability, and resilience endure where size cannot. The ocean, vast and indifferent, writes these lessons in the lives of its creatures, erasing and rewriting its hierarchies in time with the turning of the earth. To speak of Megalodon now is to speak of impermanence, but also of awe. It is a reminder that nature is capable of creating predators beyond imagination and of erasing them with equal ease. It is a story of fragility within grandeur, of power undone not by violence but by change. Its teeth, found in riverbeds and cliffsides, are not merely fossils but fragments of a larger truth, that nothing, however mighty, can escape the shifting tides of earth. The sea did not grieve when Megalodon vanished. It reshaped itself as it always has, crowning new rulers and redistributing power. But in its silence, we find something that resonates still. The giant shark may be gone, but its story endures, in fossils, in myths, in the living descendants of its rivals and prey. And within that story lies a question as deep as the ocean itself. What giants of our age, whether animal or human, do we imagine to be eternal, only to see them vanish when the world turns again? Megalodon's shadow stretches across time, not as a monster hiding in the deep, but as a reminder of cycles larger than any creature. It tells us that dominance is fleeting, that life is resilient, and that the ocean always moves forward, erasing kings and crowning new ones. Its extinction was not an end, but part of the rhythm, a rhythm that continues to shape the seas we know and the seas still to come. The silence left by Megalodon's disappearance did not linger long in ecological terms. Nature abhors a void, and in the centuries that followed its extinction, other creatures rose to fill the spaces it had once defined. The oceans, restless and adaptable, reshaped themselves without pause, proving once again that no predator, no matter how supreme, is indispensable to the continuity of life. Yet the absence of the giant shark echoed in subtle ways, influencing not just the creatures that survived, but the very structure of the ecosystems that evolved in its wake. Whales were among the greatest beneficiaries of Megalodon's absence. Once stalked by the colossal predator, they now swam in seas freer than ever before. Their populations expanded, their ranges broadened, and their evolutionary paths were no longer hemmed by the constant threat of predation from below. Freed from the selective pressure of being relentlessly hunted, they grew even larger. The blue whale, a product of this new order, became the largest creature to have ever lived, surpassing even Megalodon in scale. It is a paradox of evolution. The extinction of one giant paved the way for another, one not defined by tooth and muscle, but by size and endurance, feeding not on flesh, but on clouds of plankton. In this shift lies a profound truth. Power in the oceans had transitioned from predation to endurance, from hunting strength to feeding efficiency. Orcas inherited another fragment of the legacy. Their cooperative strategies elevated them to the rank of apex predators in modern seas. Unlike Megalodon, which relied on solitary power, orcas thrived through intelligence, communication, and collaboration. Their pods developed specialized hunting techniques, some targeting fish, others focusing on seals, still others on whale calves. This diversity of strategies made them resilient, capable of adjusting to changes in prey and environment. Where Megalodon's survival had depended on abundance, orcas endured by adapting to scarcity. Their rise demonstrates the ocean's preference for flexibility over enormity, for minds that can adjust over bodies too vast to bend. Great white sharks, too, emerged as heirs in form if not in scale. Though they could never match Megalodon's colossal size, they carried echoes of its design. Serrated teeth, streamlined bodies, and ambush tactics were hallmarks shared across lineage. Yet the great white's genius lay in efficiency. Unlike its ancestor, it could subsist on smaller prey, survive across colder waters, and reproduce more readily. Its smaller size made it less awe-inspiring, but far more adaptable to the fluctuating conditions of the Pleistocene and Holocene. In them, the shadow of Megalodon persists, not in magnitude but in refinement. But the impact of Megalodon's extinction was not limited to its immediate successors. It rippled downward through the food web. With fewer large predators to regulate populations of whales and seals, certain marine communities expanded dramatically. Whale falls, the sinking of massive carcasses to the sea floor, became more common, feeding entire ecosystems in the abyss. In this way, the extinction of one predator indirectly enriched life thousands of meters below the surface. Worms, mollusks, crustaceans, and bacteria thrived on these sunken monuments of flesh, building their own fragile kingdoms on the bones of giants. Life, ever opportunistic, turned absence into abundance. For humans, who would one day walk the earth long after Megalodon's extinction, its legacy became myth. Fossilized teeth unearthed from cliffs and riverbeds were mistaken for the tongues of dragons or relics of monstrous serpents. Legends arose around them, and though science eventually revealed the truth, the fascination endured. Even today, popular imagination clings to the possibility that Megalodon survives in the ocean's unexplored depths. Stories of a leviathan lurking in the abyss persist, not because evidence supports them, but because humanity resists finality. We do not easily accept that something so vast could vanish forever, yet the truth is richer than the myth. Megalodon's extinction demonstrates the fragility of dominance, the way in which even the most supreme predator is tethered to the shifting foundations of its world. Climate cooling, the rise of new competitors, the evolution of prey, and the limitations of gigantism all conspired against it. None of these forces alone was decisive, but together they wove a net of inevitability. The shark did not vanish because it was weak. It vanished because the world that sustained it no longer existed. Its extinction is not a failure, but a reflection of the ocean's perpetual transformation. Picture a modern ocean in the wake of this transformation. Blue whales glide through waters once patrolled by Megalodon, their immense bodies unchallenged. Orcas circle in pods, their whistles slicing through the waves as they coordinate a hunt. Great whites move silently along coasts, their shadows faint echoes of a predator long gone. Each of these creatures carries a piece of the giant's legacy, whether in freedom, strategy, or design. The ocean itself carries the rest, its ecosystems reorganized by the absence of a force that once sculpted them. And still, the fascination lingers. We marvel at the scale of Megalodon's teeth, at the enormity of the jaws reconstructed in museums. We imagine what it must have been like to swim in seas where its presence was a constant threat, to live in a world where a predator the size of a bus rose from the depths in ambush. We tell stories not only to remember, but to wrestle with the idea that power fades, that dominance is fleeting, that even the mightiest are undone by time. In Megalodon, we see the grandeur of life at its extremes, and in its extinction, we see the inevitability of change. The sea moves forward without pause. It does not preserve rulers, it crowns them, sustains them, and eventually erases them. Megalodon's reign lasted millions of years, longer than the span of our own species, but it ended as all reigns do. What remains is its imprint, in fossils that gleam like stone knives, in the whales that grew beyond its reach, in the predators that learned cooperation, and in the human imagination that refuses to let it go. Its story is not only about the might of a shark, but about the impermanence of supremacy and the resilience of life itself. And so, the shadow of Megalodon endures not as a living presence, but as a lesson. It reminds us that no power, however vast, escapes the turning of Earth's cycles. It reminds us that abundance is temporary, that survival favours those who adapt, and that extinction is not an end but a transformation. The seas we know today, filled with whales, orcas and sharks that thrive in countless forms, are part of its legacy. To look into the ocean now is to glimpse the echoes of giants, and to remember that their passing was not silence, but the beginning of a new song. The seas that inherited the silence of Megalodon were not diminished but altered. The predator that had once ruled with sheer force had vanished, and in its absence, the oceans rebalanced themselves with new rulers, new strategies, and new rhythms of survival. Yet the memory of the giant remained inscribed in stone and bone, in the fossils scattered across continents, and in the stories humans would one day weave from those relics. Its extinction was both an ending and a beginning, an inflection point in the eternal cycle of life's rise and fall. The vast evolutionary legacy of Megalodon stretches beyond its reign. It is found in the way whales expanded, in the intelligence of orcas, in the cunning of smaller sharks, and in the very structure of marine ecosystems. Without Megalodon pruning populations of whales, the seas entered a new phase of abundance. Baleen whales, feeding on krill, thrived without constant predation pressure, reaching sizes larger than any animal before them. The very fact that blue whales, the largest creatures ever known, could evolve is inseparable from the absence of their colossal hunter. Megalodon had once defined the ceiling of marine gigantism by its very presence, but when it vanished, that ceiling lifted and life responded by reaching higher. Orcas filled another void. They did not grow into giants. Instead, they grew into thinkers. Their cooperative hunting strategies allowed them to exploit prey that brute force alone could not control. Their social structures became laboratories of survival, where knowledge was passed down across generations, where tactics were learned, refined, and adapted to changing conditions. Some pods specialized in hunting seals on ice floes, others targeted fish schools, while still others developed techniques to harass and isolate young whales. This cultural flexibility made them heirs to the role of apex predator in ways Megalodon never could have been. In orcas, the oceans chose intelligence over enormity, adaptability over sheer dominance. Great whites, though far smaller, carried the physical legacy of their colossal cousin. Their serrated teeth, ambush strategies, and powerful jaws echoed the evolutionary design that had made Megalodon so formidable. But unlike their ancestor, they were not bound to gigantism. They thrived on smaller prey, endured colder waters, and survived in greater numbers. Where Megalodon had been a singular ruler, great whites became one of many, efficient, widespread, and enduring. In their smaller scale, they carried a wisdom of survival, to live within the ocean's limits, rather than to push against them. The ripple effects of Megalodon's extinction extended deep into the food web. With whale populations expanding, whalefalls became a defining feature of the deep ocean. Each carcass that sank to the seafloor became a world in itself, sustaining life for decades. Worms, mollusks, bacteria, and crustaceans evolved to exploit this bounty, their existence tied to the rhythms of giants above. In a strange irony, Megalodon's absence enriched the abyss more than its presence ever had. The predator that once ruled the open seas gave way to a cycle of life and death that fed the hidden kingdoms of the deep. And yet, the fascination with Megalodon has never belonged only to the creatures of the sea. For humans, its story is one of wonder and fear, of power and fragility. Its teeth, enormous and serrated, became objects of myth long before science revealed their true origin. Ancient peoples called them tongue stones, believing them to be remnants of dragons or serpents. They were worn as talismans, symbols of protection against evil. In this way, Megalodon lived on not just as a predator, but as a creature of legend, shaping human imagination across millennia. When paleontology uncovered the truth that these relics belonged to a shark larger than any alive today, the fascination deepened. To imagine an animal 60 feet long, with jaws wide enough to engulf a car, is to confront the scale of nature's ambition. Even now, myths persist that Megalodon survives in unexplored depths. Stories claim it lurks in the Mariana Trench, hidden beyond sonar, waiting to resurface. These tales endure not because they are plausible, but because they reflect a human desire for mystery. To believe in Megalodon is to believe that the ocean still holds secrets too vast for us to uncover, that we have not yet tamed its deeper shadows. But the truth, though quieter, is more profound. Megalodon's extinction is a reminder of impermanence, that even the mightiest rulers are subject to the shifting of Earth's cycles. Climate cooling, shrinking nurseries, the evolution of prey, and the rise of new predators all conspire to end its reign. No single cause erased it. Instead, a web of pressures slowly tightened until the giant could no longer endure. It did not fall in a battle, nor vanish in a single catastrophe. It faded as ecosystems shifted, as conditions slipped beyond its grasp. In this lies the humbling truth. Power is never eternal, and yet extinction is not simply loss, it is transformation. Megalodon's disappearance shaped the seas we know today. Whales as giants of endurance, orcas as masters of cooperation, great whites as efficient heirs. All of these legacies are in part the result of its absence. The oceans that exist now are written by the silence it left. Every breach of a whale, every coordinated hunt of an orca, every swift strike of a shark carrying echoes of the predator that once ruled. Imagine standing on a modern coastline. The horizon stretches endlessly, waves rising and falling in timeless rhythm. Beneath, blue whales move like mountains through water, orcas whistle in pods, and great whites patrol in silence. Somewhere on the sea floor, a Megalodon tooth lies buried, a relic of an age when the ocean belonged to giants. To touch it is to touch not just a predator, but a story of transformation, a story that begins with dominance and ends with silence, yet in that silence reshapes the entire balance of life. For humanity, the lesson of Megalodon is twofold. It shows us the grandeur of nature, its capacity to create beings beyond imagination. But it also shows us fragility, the inevitability that even the strongest are bound to the limits of their environment. We see in its extinction not failure, but inevitability, the cost of being too specialized, too immense, too dependent on abundance. Its story is a mirror for our own time, when giants of different kinds face pressures from a changing world. The oceans move forward, as they always have. They do not preserve kings, they crown them, sustain them, and in time erase them. Megalodon ruled longer than most species survive, yet it too yielded to the tides of change. What remains are its teeth, its fossils, its myths, and its echoes in the living seas. In the breach of a whale, the hunt of an orca, the strike of a shark, its presence endures. And so the question lingers, as deep as the ocean itself. When the earth turns again, as it always does, which rulers of our time will fade into silence, leaving only shadows and fragments behind? In the story of Megalodon lies the answer, not in monsters lurking in the deep, but in the cycles of change that shape all life, giants and small alike. Long after Megalodon's final shadow slipped into extinction, its presence continued to ripple invisibly through the oceans. The predator was gone, but the seas bore the imprint of its rule in the behaviours of whales, in the strategies of predators, and in the ecological rhythms that adapted to life without a giant hunter. In this way, the story of Megalodon is not simply a tale of rise and fall, but of echoes, traces of a vanished colossus woven into the fabric of the living ocean. One of the most enduring echoes is found in the whales themselves. Baleen whales, relieved of the relentless predation pressure of Megalodon, expanded their ecological dominance. They grew to unprecedented sizes, free to cross oceans without constant fear of ambush. Their calves, once vulnerable, were now more likely to survive, strengthening populations and fueling evolutionary momentum. The largest animal to ever exist, the blue whale, owes part of its success to this release from predation. It is a strange paradox. The extinction of one giant enabled the rise of another, shifting the very expression of marine gigantism from predator to prey. In the absence of Megalodon, whales inherited the seas not as victims but as sovereigns. Another echo lies in the cooperative predators that rose to prominence. Orcas, with their remarkable intelligence, became apex predators by strategy rather than size. They thrived in environments where adaptability was paramount, learning techniques tailored to their local prey and passing knowledge down through generations. Some pods developed the skill of tipping seals from ice flows. Others learned to create waves to wash prey into their reach. Still others perfected the harassment of larger whales. Each technique represented a kind of cultural inheritance, a survival strategy rooted not in physical dominance but in cooperation. In them, the oceans revealed a new truth, that intelligence could achieve what size no longer could. Their reign was not born of replacing Megalodon directly, but of filling the void in ways more flexible than any giant could. Great white sharks represent yet another legacy, a smaller but still fearsome echo of their colossal cousin. They inherited the serrated teeth, the ambush tactics, and the stealth that had once made Megalodon unrivaled. But they did not carry the burden of gigantism. Instead, they survived by being opportunistic, thriving on seals, fish, and scavenged carrion. They patrolled colder waters, adapted to changing prey, and reproduced more readily than any giant ever could. In their success lies the evolutionary principle that felled Megalodon. Adaptability is stronger than sheer magnitude. To see a great white breach from the sea in a flash of muscle and teeth is to glimpse the shadow of Megalodon, not in size, but in strategy honed by millions of years of lineage. The extinction of Megalodon also reshaped ecosystems in subtler ways. Whale falls, the sinking of whale carcasses to the sea floor, became a dominant source of nutrients for deep-sea life. Entire communities of creatures evolved to exploit them, worms that fed on bone, mollusks that lived off sulfur-rich bacteria, and scavengers that thrived in the dark. These ecosystems existed during Megalodon's reign, but in its absence they flourished more abundantly, fed by the unchecked expansion of whales. The predator that once ruled the surface waters thus influenced even the deepest trenches, its absence fueling life in realms it had never touched. For humans, Megalodon's story is not just natural history but mythology. Its teeth, massive and serrated, have captured our imagination for centuries. Before science, they were believed to be the tongues of dragons or relics of great serpents. Even when paleontology revealed their true nature, fascination did not diminish. Instead, it grew, transmuting into speculation and storytelling. What if Megalodon still lurks in the ocean's unexplored depths? What if the abyss hides a predator too vast to comprehend? These myths endure not because they are plausible, but because they speak to a primal part of us. The fear and wonder of the sea, the suspicion that its shadows still conceal monsters, and yet the reality is more profound than the myth. The disappearance of Megalodon was not sudden but gradual, stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. It was undone not by one blow but by a combination of forces: climate cooling, shifting currents, shrinking nurseries, evolving prey, and the rise of rivals. It is a story not of weakness but of inevitability, a reminder that even the greatest are subject to change. The predator that once ruled unchallenged was undone by the slow, patient forces of Earth itself. Its fate was not a catastrophe, but a cycle, a chapter in the endless rewriting of life. This cycle holds lessons for us today. Megalodon's extinction shows how power, even when overwhelming, is fragile. Giants are born in times of abundance, but when conditions shift, they become vulnerable. Survival favours the adaptable, not the monumental. In a world of rapid climate change, the story of Megalodon resonates as a warning. It reminds us that no dominance is permanent, that abundance can vanish, and that the ocean always rewrites its hierarchies. The fate of the giant shark is a mirror for the present, reflecting the precariousness of all who assume permanence in a world that never stands still. Imagine standing on a cliff above a modern ocean. The water stretches endless, shimmering under the sun. Whales breach in the distance, their massive bodies unchallenged. Orcas move in coordinated pods, their whistles echoing in the air. Great whites patrol unseen, their shadows gliding just beneath the waves. And in the sediment beneath those waters lies a Megalodon tooth, a fragment of an age when one predator ruled them all. To hold it is to feel both awe and humility, awe at the grandeur of what once lived, and humility at the fragility of even the mightiest. The ocean does not keep its rulers. It crowns them, sustains them, and erases them when conditions turn. Megalodon ruled longer than humanity has existed, yet it too yielded to the tides of change. What remains is its legacy, in fossils, in the creatures that succeeded it, and in the human imagination that refuses to let it go. Its story is not only about extinction, but about continuity, the way life reshapes itself around absence, the way ecosystems adapt to fill the void, the way memory carries forward even when flesh does not. And so Megalodon endures, not in hidden depths, but in the living sea. In the blue whale's colossal breath, in the orca's cunning hunt, in the great white's silent strike, there are echoes of a predator long gone. The giant shark is not waiting to be rediscovered. It is already here, in every ripple of the ocean it helped shape. Its reign has ended, but its shadow lingers in every tide, a reminder that the ocean belongs not to rulers, but to time itself. The story of Megalodon does not end with its extinction. It continues, etched into the layers of stone, whispered by the fossils uncovered from riverbeds and cliffsides, and carried in the imagination of those who gaze at the ocean and wonder what once swam there. Its reign, spanning millions of years, is a reminder of both the grandeur and the fragility of life. To tell its story is not only to recall the rise and fall of a predator, but to trace the deeper rhythms of the planet itself, cycles of abundance and scarcity, of dominance and decline, of creation and erasure. When we look at a megalodon tooth, larger than a human hand, its serrated edge still sharp after millions of years, we hold more than a fossil. We hold a fragment of history that speaks of oceans warmer, fuller, and richer than those we know today. We hold the memory of hunts where the largest predators the Earth has ever produced stalked prey that dwarfs our modern imagination. We hold, too, the silence of extinction, the reminder that even the sharpest tooth cannot bite against the tides of time. These relics are monuments to impermanence, reminders that every kingdom, no matter how vast, must fall. Yet in falling, Megalodon reshaped the seas. Its absence allowed whales to flourish, reaching sizes greater than ever before. Blue whales, the largest creatures to ever exist, swim today in freedom that their ancestors could not have known. Orcas, through intelligence and cooperation, inherited the mantle of apex predator, thriving in ways Megalodon never could. Great whites, smaller but efficient, rose as heirs to its lineage, their form carrying echoes of their colossal cousin. Even the deep sea bears the mark of Megalodon's absence. Whale falls, more abundant without the giant hunter, became engines of life in the abyss. In this way, Megalodon lives on not in flesh, but in the very architecture of ecosystems that adapted to its disappearance. For humans, the fascination with Megalodon reveals as much about ourselves as about the shark. We are drawn to its scale, to the enormity of its presence, to the idea of a creature so powerful it seemed untouchable. Its extinction unsettles us, because it proves that nothing is immune to change. The myths we spin, of Megalodon still lurking in the depths, of leviathans waiting in trenches unseen, speak to our desire for mystery, for the belief that the ocean still hides secrets too immense for us to master. But science reminds us that its silence is real, that the predator is gone, and that its survival now lies only in memory, fossils, and imagination. This duality, myth and science, awe and truth, is where Megalodon's legacy endures most vividly. The shark becomes not only a subject of paleontology, but of philosophy. It asks us to consider the nature of power, of permanence, of fragility. It reminds us that even those species perfected by evolution can vanish, not through weakness, but through inevitability. Climate shifts, ecological changes, and evolutionary pressures erase even the strongest. Megalodon's fate is not an anomaly, but a reflection of the rules that govern all life. Picture the ocean now. Its surface glitters with sunlight, Its depths remain largely unknown, and within it swim creatures that bear fragments of Megalodon's legacy. The breach of a blue whale recalls the freedom won in its absence. The whistle of an orcapod echoes strategies born from filling the void it left. The silent glide of a great white mirrors the efficiency that ensured survival where gigantism failed. In every corner of the sea, in every predator and prey, there are traces of the giant that once ruled. The ocean we inherit today is, in part, a creation of Megalodon's departure. And perhaps this is the greatest truth. Extinction is not only loss, but transformation. The fall of one species reshapes the fate of many, weaving new patterns into the web of life. Megalodon's extinction did not empty the seas, it redefined them, setting the stage for the ocean as we know it. Its silence was not the end of a story, but the beginning of another, written in the survival of whales, orcas, sharks, and countless others. This is the rhythm of life on Earth. Rise, reign, fall, and renewal. For us, living in a time when extinction again looms large, the lesson of Megalodon resonates with urgency. It teaches that no power, no abundance, no supremacy lasts forever. The giants of today, whether whales, elephants, or even human civilization itself, are bound by the same cycles. To endure requires not size, not dominance, but adaptability. The ocean that erased Megalodon will continue to erase and reshape, as it always has, long after our own age has passed. And yet, Megalodon's story is not simply a warning, it is also a gift of awe. To imagine a creature so immense, so powerful that it could dictate the behaviour of entire species is to glimpse the extraordinary potential of life. Its reign was a testament to nature's creativity, its extinction a testament to nature's balance. Both truths are equally magnificent. The ocean did not grieve its passing, but we, in remembering, can marvel at the grandeur of what once was. Standing at the edge of the sea, we hear its waves echo across time. They carry the whispers of giants, the silence of extinctions, and the songs of life that endures. Megalodon may no longer swim beneath the waves, but its presence lingers in every fossil, in every myth, in every living creature that carries its legacy forward. To tell its story is to acknowledge that nothing lasts forever, and yet nothing is ever truly gone, for the sea remembers. It remembers in the freedom of whales, in the cunning of orcas, in the sharpness of shark teeth cutting through flesh, and in the fossils that rise from stone to light. It remembers in the silence where once there was thunder, and in the balance that followed its fall. Megalodon's reign has ended, but its story endures, a reminder that the ocean belongs not to rulers, but to time itself, and that even giants leave only shadows when the tides turn. And so, the final truth of Megalodon is not tragedy but transformation. It was a king of the seas, a sculptor of balance, a shadow of awe. It vanished not in failure, but in the inevitability of Earth's cycles. And in its vanishing, it gave rise to the oceans we know today. Its silence is not absence, but legacy, woven into every current, every migration, every breath of the sea. Megalodon's reign has ended, but its shadow will forever move with the tides, a reminder that even giants must yield to change,